Second Class Citizen, Chapter 1 to Chapter 5. Chapter 1, Childhood.
It had all begun like a dream. You know, that sort of dream which seems to have originated from nowhere, yet one was always aware of its existence. One could feel it, one could be directed by it, unconsciously at first, until it became a reality, a presence. Ada did not know for sure what gave birth to her dream when it all started, but the earliest anchor she could pin down in this drift of nothingness was when she was about 8 years old. She was not even quite sure that she was exactly 8 because, you see, she was a girl. She was a girl who had arrived when everyone was expecting and predicting a boy. So, since she was such a disappointment to her parents, to her immediate family, to her tribe, nobody thought of recording her birth. She was so insignificant. One thing was certain, though, she was born during the Second World War. She felt 8 when she was being directed by her dream, for a younger child would not be capable of so many mischiefs. Thinking back on it all now that she was grown up, she was sorry for her parents. But it was their own fault. They should not have had her in the first place, and that would have saved a lot of people a lot of headaches. Well, Ada thought she was 8 at the time when her mother and all the other society women were busying themselves to welcome the very first lawyer of their town, Abusa. Whenever Ada was told that Abusa was her town, she found it difficult to understand. Her parents, she was told, came from Abusa, and so did many of her aunts and uncles. Abusa, she was told, was a beautiful town. She had been taught at an early age that the people of Abusa were friendly, that the food there was fresh, the spring water was pure, and the air was clean. The virtues of Abusa were praised so much that Ada came to regard her being born in a god-forsaken place like Lagos as a misfortune. Her parents said that Lagos was a bad place, bad for bringing up children because here they picked up the Yoruba and body accent. It was bad because it was a town with laws. A town where law ruled supreme. In Abusa, they said, you took the law into your own hands. If a woman abused your child, you went straight into her hut, dragged her out, beat her up or got beaten up, as the case might be. So, if you didn't want to be dragged out and beaten up, you wouldn't abuse another woman's child. Lagos was bad because this type of behavior was not allowed. You had to learn to control your temper, which Ada was taught was against the law of nature. The Abusa women who lived in Lagos were preparing for the arrival of the town's first lawyer from the United Kingdom. The title, United Kingdom, when pronounced by Ada's father sounded so heavy, like the type of noise one associated with bombs. It was so deep, so mysterious, that Ada's father always voiced it in hushed tones, wearing such a respectful expression as if he were speaking of God's holiest of holies. Going to the United Kingdom must surely be like paying God a visit. The United Kingdom, then, must be like heaven. The women of Abusa bought identical cotton material from the UAC department store and had it made into lapis and blouses of the same style. They dyed their hair and straightened it with hot combs to make it look European. Nobody in her right senses would dream of welcoming a lawyer who had been to the United Kingdom with her hair left natural Hawaiian curls. They composed songs, weaving the name of the new lawyer into them. These women were so proud of this new lawyer because to them it meant the arrival of their very own Messiah. A Messiah special why created for the Abusa people. A Messiah who would go into politics and fight for the rights of the people of Abusa. A Messiah who would see to it that Abusa would have electricity, that Abusa would have a tarred road, which Ada's mother called Kaltar. Oh, yes, Lawyer Nuiz was going to do all sorts of things for the people of Abusa. Ada's mother was a seamstress, so she made most of the blouses. Ada was very lucky. because she had some remnants from the material made into a frock for her. She still remembered the frock. It was so big for her that she more or less swam into it. Her mother would never dream of making her a dress that was exactly her size because, you see, she would soon outgrow it. So even though she was a small girl, too skinny for her age, whatever that might be, she always had dresses 3 or 4 sizes bigger. That was one of her reasons for liking old dresses, since by the time her dresses were old, they fitted her. Still, she was so happy with this new lawyer dress that she begged her mother to let her go with the women to the Apapa wharf on the great day. It pained her so much when she realized that she was not going to be allowed to go because it fell on a school day. School the Igbos never played with that. They were realizing fast that one savior from poverty and disease was education. Every Igbo family saw to it that their children attended school. Boys were usually given preference, though. So even though Otto was about 8, there were still discussions about whether it would be wise to send her to school. Even if she was sent to school, it was very doubtful whether it would be wise to let her stay long. A year or 2 would do, as long as she can write her name and count. Then she will learn how to sew. Ada had heard her mother say this many, many times to her friends. Soon, Ada's younger brother, Boy, started school. It was at this time that Ada's dreams started to nudge her. Whenever she took Boy to Lady Lack Institute, as the school was called, she would stand by the gate and watch all her friends lining up by the school door in their smart navy blue pinafores, looking clean and orderly. Lady Lack was then, and still is, a very small preparatory school. Children were not taught Yoruba or any African language. This was why it was such an expensive school. The proprietress was trained in the United Kingdom. At that time, more than half the children in the school were Igbos, as they were then highly motivated by middle-class values. Ada would stand there, filled with envy. This envy later gave way to frustration, which she showed in many small ways. She would lie, just for the joy of lying. She took secret joy in disobeying her mother. Because, she thought to herself, if not for Ma, Pa would have seen to it that I started school with Boy. One afternoon, Ma was sitting on the veranda of their house at Akinwunmi Street. With Ada's help, she had cooked the afternoon meal and they had both eaten. Ma started to undo her hair, ready to have it replaited. Ada had seen her do this a million times and was bored with watching her. There was nothing for her to do. There was nobody to play with. There was not even any mischief to plan. Then the thought suddenly struck her. Yes, she would go to school. She would not got to Lady Lack, because Boy was there and they might ask her to pay, it being such an expensive school. She would go to the Methodist school round the corner. It was cheaper. Her ma had said that she liked the uniform. Most of her friends attended it, and Mr. Cole, the Sierra Leonean neighbor living next door to them, taught there. Yes, she would go there. Her dress was clean enough, though it was too big, but she thought of something to smarten it up. She went into their room, got an old scarf, twisted it round and round, so much so that it looked like a palm tree climber's rope, then tied it round her little waist, pulling her baggy dress up a little. Other children went to school with slates and pencils. She had none. It would look ridiculous for her to march into a classroom without a slate and pencil. Then another thought struck her. She had always watched Pa shave. Pa had a broken slate, on which he usually sharpened a funny sort of curved knife. Ada often watched him do this, fascinated. After sharpening the knife, Pa would rub some carbolic soap lather on his chin and then would shave away. Ada thought of the slate, but the trouble was that it was so small, just a small piece. It would not take many letters, but a small bit of slate was better than no slate at all. She then slipped it into the top of her dress, knowing full well that her scarf belt would hold it up. Luck was with her. Before she left the room, One of Ma's innumerable friends came for a visit, and the two women were so engrossed in their chit-chat that they did not notice when Ada slipped past them. Thus Ada went to school. She ran as fast as she could before anyone could stop her. She did not see any of Ma's friends because it was past midday and very hot. Most people were too tired to walk the streets at this time. She got tired running and she started to trot like a lame horse. Tired of trotting, she walked. She was soon at the schoolroom. There were two buildings in the compound. One was the church, and she had heard from her friends that the church was never used as a classroom. She knew which was the church because, even though she had not started school, she attended Sunday school in the church. With her head up, in determination, she walked down the center looking for Mr. Cole's class. This was easy for her because all the classes were separated from each other by low cardboard-like partitions. It was easy to see all the classes simply by walking down the middle. When she saw Mr. Cole, she walked into his class and stood behind him. The other children looked up from their work and stared at Ada in wonder. At first there was a hush so tangible that one could almost hold and feel it. Then one silly child started to giggle and the others followed suit, until almost every child in the class was giggling in such an uncontrollable way that Mr. Cole glared at the children who had all gone crazy, for all he knew. Then it happened. The child who started the giggle covered her mouth with one hand and pointed at Ada with the other. Mr. Cole was a huge African, very young, very handsome. He was a real black man. His blackness shone like polished black leather. He was a very quiet man, but he used to smile at Ada every time he passed her on his way to school. Ada was sure Mr. Cole would give her that reassuring smile now, in front of all these giggling idiots. Mr. Cole spun round with such alacrity that Ada took a step backwards. She was not frightened of Mr. Cole. It was just that the movement was so quick and so unexpected of Mr. Cole, with his great bulk. Only God above knew what he expected to find behind him. A big gorilla or a wandering masquerade, perhaps. But all he saw as Ada, staring at him. God bless Mr. Cole. He did not laugh. He took in the situation immediately, gave Ada one of those special smiles, held out his hand, and led her to a boy who had craw-craw on his head, and gestured to her to sit down. Ada did not know what to make of this gesture. She felt Mr. Cole should have asked her why she came, but being reassured by his smile, she said, in her little loud voice, "I came to school my parents would not send me." The class went quiet once more, the boy with the craw-craw on his head. He later became a lecturer in Lagos City Hospital, gave her a bit of his pencil, and Ada scribbled away, enjoying the smell of craw-craw and dried sweat. She never forgot this smell of school. The day ended too soon for Ada's liking. But they must go home, Mr. Cole assured her. Yes, of course, she could come again if she liked, but if her parents would not allow her to come, he would take it upon himself to teach her the alphabet. If only Mr. Cole would not bring her parents into it. Pa would be all right. He would probably cane her, just a few strokes 6 or so. Not much, but Ma would not cane. She would smack, and then nag and nag all day long. She thought that it was these experiences with Ma so early in life that had given her such a very low opinion of her own sex. Somebody said somewhere that our characters are usual wife formed early in life. Yes, that somebody was right. Women still made Ada nervous. They had a way of sapping her self-confidence. She did have 1 or 2 women friends with whom she discussed the weather and fashion. But when in real trouble, she would rather look for a man. Men were so solid, so safe. Mr. Cole took her to the stall of a woman selling boli, which is the Yoruba name for roasted plantain. These women usually had open pots in which they made a kind of coal fire. These fires were covered with wire gauze, and on the gauze were placed peeled plantains, ready for roasting. Mr. Cole fed her with a big bully and told her not to worry. It was another story when they got home. At home, things had got out of hand. In fact, there was a big hullabaloo going on. Pa had been called from work. Ma was with the police being charged with child neglect, and the child that had caused all the fuss was little Otta, staring at all of them, afraid and yet triumphant. They took Ma to the police station and forced her to drink a big bowl of gari with water. Gari is a tasteless sort of flour made from cassava. When cooked and eaten with soup, it is delicious. But when uncooked, the watertight Ma was forced to drink. It became a torture, purgatorial. In fact, those policemen, Otis still wondered where they got all their unwritten laws from. This happened at the police station at Sabo Market. Ma told them with tears in her eyes that she could swallow the gari no more. She must drink the whole lot, she was told, and told in such language that Otta hid behind Mr. Cole. If Ma did not finish the gari, the policeman went on, they would take her to court. How they laughed at their own jokes, those horrid men, and how they scared Otta. Ma went on gulping, her eyes dilating. Otta was scared. She started to howl, and Pa, who had said very little, begged the policeman to stop. They should let Ma go now, he explained, for she had learned her lesson. She was a great talker, very careless. Otherwise, Otta would not have been able to slip away as she had. Women were like that. They sat in the house, ate, gossiped, and slept. They would not even look after their children properly. But the policeman should forgive her now, because Pa thought she had had enough gari. The chief policeman considered this plea, then looked once more at Ma, cupping the gari to her mouth with her fingers, and smiled. He took pity on Ma, but warned her that if such a thing should happen again, he personally would take her to the court. You know what that means, he thundered. Ma nodded. She knew court meant two things: a heavy fine which she would never be able to afford, or prison, which she called pillizin. They advised her to sell one of her colorful lapis and send Otta to school, because she looked like a child who was keen to learn. At this point, Ma gave Otta a queer look, a look that contained a mixture of fear, love, and wonder. Otta shrank back, still clutching Mr. Cole. When they got home from the station, the news had already got round. Otta had nearly sent her mother to Pillizin. So frequently was this sentence repeated that Otta began to be quite proud of her impulsive move. She felt triumphant, a special why when she heard Pa's friends advising him to make sure he owed Otta to start school soon. This discussion took place on the veranda, where the visitors were downing 2 kegs of palm wine to wet their parched throats. When they departed, Otta was left alone with her parents. Things were not as bad as she thought they would be. Pa fished out the cane and gave her a few strokes for Ma's benefit. Otta did not mind that because they were not hard strokes. Maybe Pa had been mellowed by the talk with his friends, because when Otta cried after the caning, he came and talked to her seriously, just as if she were a grown-up. He called her by her pet name, Anenina, which means father's mother, which was not so far from the meaning of Otta's real name. How she came by that name was a story in itself. When Pa's mother was dying, she had promised Pa that she would come again, this time as his daughter. She was sorry she could not live to bring him up. She died when Pa was only 5. She would come again, she had promised, to compensate for leaving him so young. Well, Pa grew up and married Ma at the Christ Church in Lagos, which was a Christian church. But Pa did not forget his mother's promise. The only reservation he had was that he did not want a girl for his first child. Well, his mother was impatient. Ma had a girl. Pa thought Otta was the very picture of his mother, even though Otta was born 2 months prematurely. He was quite positive that the little, damp, monkey-like thing with the unformed face was his come-back mother. So she was loaded with strings of names: Anenina, Adana, Ada Is. Ada Is means princess, daughter of a king. Sometimes they call at her Ada ease, sometimes Ada na, and sometimes Aneni na. But this string of names was too long and too confusing for Ada's Yoruba friends and playmates, and even more so, for impatient Ma. So she became just Ada. She didn't mind this. It was short, everybody could pronounce it. When she grew up and was attending the Methodist Girls' High School in Lagos, where she came in contact with European missionaries, her name was one of the first ones they learned and pronounced correctly. This usual why gave her a start against the other girls with long names like Adabizi Bambos or Alyuafun Maleo Alaran Shogo. So that was how Ada started school. Pa would not hear of her going to the Methodist primary. She was to go to the posh one, Lady Lack. Success in life would surely have come earlier to her if Pa had lived. But he died soon after, and Ada and her brother boy were transferred to an inferior school. Despite all this, Ada's dream never left her. It was understandable that Ma refused to take her to see the new lawyer because Ada had started school only a few weeks before the preparations for the great man's arrival. Ma Rilwai got furious with Ada for asking such a thing. You made me drink Gari only last month until I nearly burst my stomach, all because you said you wanted school. Now we gave you school. You want the wharf. No, you won't go. You chose school. To school you must go from now until you go gray. How right Ma was. Ada would never stop learning. She had been a student ever since. Ada's face had fallen at this. If only she had known before, she would have staged her school drama after the arrival of Lawyer Nuiz. But as it turned out, she missed little. The women practiced their songs several times and showed off their uniform, to which they had given the name Azadiji Jida Agali, Oba, meaning, when a good man holds a woman, she becomes like the queen. They wove the name of the uniform into the song, and it was a joy to hear and see these women, happy in their innocence, just like children. Their wants were simple and easily met. Not like those of their children who later got caught up in the entangled web of industrialization. Ada's Ma had no experience of having to keep up mortgage payments. She never knew what it was to have a family car or worry about its innards. She had no worries about pollution, the population explosion, or race. Was it surprising, therefore, that she was happy, being unaware of the so-called joys of civilization and all its pitfalls? They went to the wharf that day, these happy women, to welcome someone who had been to have a taste of that civilization, the civilization which was soon afterwards to hook them all, like opium. That day, they were happy to welcome their man. They went in their new uniform. Ada still remembered its color. It had a dark velvety background with pale blue drawings of feathers on it. The headscarf was red, and it was tied in such a way that it displayed their straightened hair. The shoes they wore were of black patent leather called 99. No one real why knew why. Maybe it was the rhythm of the repetiton. In any case, they wore these 99 shoes with their Azadiji G da Agaliom Oba and bought new gourds which they covered with colorful beads. When these gourds were rattled, they produced sounds like the Spanish samba, with a wild African village overtone. They had had a good time, Ada was told later. They danced happily at the wharf, shaking their colorful gourds in the air. The European arrivals gaped at them. They had never seen anything like it before. The climax of it all was when an Englishman took their photographs. He even singled out women with babies behind their backs and took several shots of them. Ma and her friends were real why happy to have their pictures taken by Europeans. These were the days before Nigerian independence, when nearly every boat from England brought hundreds of English graduates and doctors to work in the schools and hospitals of Lagos. The few gaps in the magical story of Nui's arrival were filled in by Pa. All the Abusa men went to welcome him the following Sunday. They could not leave their places of work during the week. Pa said that the lawyer could not swallow pounded yam anymore. He could not even eat a piece of bone. The meat they cooked for him had to be stewed for days until it was almost a pulp. I felt like being sick, Pa said as he spat on the floor. It reminded me of the sickly, watery food we ate in the army. There is one thing, though, Pa went on. He did not bring a white woman with him. Alpa's friends agreed with him that that was a good thing. If Nuis had brought a white woman to Abusa, Oboshi would have sent leprosy on her. Remembering all these taboos and superstitions of the Western Igbos of Nigeria, Ada could not help laughing to herself. She had been brought up with them. They were part of her. Yet now, in the 70s, the thought of them amused her. The funniest thing about all these superstitions and beliefs was that they still had such a doleful grip on the minds of her people. No one dared ignore any of them. Leprosy was a disease with which the goddess of the biggest river in Abusa cursed anyone who dared to flout one of the town's traditions. Well, Pa and his friends toasted the goddess of the river Oboshi for not allowing lawyer Nuis to go astray. That Oboshi was strong enough to guide the thoughts of Nuis demonstrated her power. They toasted her again. Later, Ada did not know what came over that river Oboshi, though. Oil was discovered very near her, and she allowed the oilmen to dig into her, without cursing them with leprosy. The oilmen were mainly white, which was a surprise. Or perhaps she had long been declared redundant by the greater gods. That would not have surprised Ada, for everybody could be declared redundant these days, even goddesses. If not redundant, then she must have been in a Rip Van Winkle sleep, for she also owed the House of Soldiers to come and massacre her sons, and some Abusa men had married white women without getting leprosy. Only last year, an Abusa girl graduate had married a white American. So Oboshi was faster than most of her sons and daughters at catching up with the times. Anyway, the talk about Nui's arrival went on for months and months. Ada talked about him to all her friends at school, telling them that he was her cousin. Well, everybody else talked big, so she might as well. But she made a secret vow to herself that she would go to this United Kingdom one day. Her arrival there would be the pinnacle of her ambition. She dared not tell anyone. They might decide to have her head examined or something. A small girl of her kind, with a father who was only a railwayman and a mother who knew nothing but the Igbo Bible and the Igbo Anglican hymn book, from the introduction to the index, and who still thought that Jerusalem was at the right hand of God. That she would go to the United Kingdom one day was a dream she kept to herself, but dreams soon assumed substance. It lived with her, just like a presence.
Second Class Citizen. Chapter 2. Escape to elitism.
Most dreams, as all dreamers know quite well, do have setbacks. Ada's dream was no exception, for hers had many. The first hitch happened all of a sudden. Just a few months after she started school, Pa went to the hospital for something. She could not remember what. Then someone. She was not quite sure who it was told her that Pa was staying there for a few days. A week or two later, Pa was brought home. A corpse. After that, things moved so fast that she sometimes got them confused. Ada, like most girl orphans, was to live with her mother's elder brother as a servant. Ma was inherited by Pa's brother, and Boy was to live with one of Pa's cousins. It was decided that the money in the family, £100 or two, would be spent on Boy's education. So Boy was cut out for a bright future, with a grammar school education and all that. Ada's schooling would have been stopped, but somebody pointed out that the longer she stayed at school, the bigger the dowry her future husband would pay for her. After all, she was too young for marriage at the age of 9 or so, and moreover, the extra money she would fetch would tide Boy over. So, for the time being, Ada stayed at school. Ada missed her old school, the cleanliness, the orderliness, and the brightness, but she could not continue there. The fee was almost 6 times the cost of the others, and she had to get herself used to an older and noisier school. Otherwise, she would not be owed to go to school at all. But she had gained something from her short stay at Lady Lac, a very good and sound beginning, which put her ahead of her new class. Her efforts amused her cousins greatly. They regarded her as a funny little girl. She was glad, though, that they merciful why left her to dream away after she had done her day's work. The day's work. Jesus. Her day started at 4:30 in the morning. On the veranda of her new home in Pike Street, there was a mighty drum. Used as a water container, and Ada had to fill this with water before going to school. This usual why meant making 10 to 12 trips to the public pump, as those public monstrosities were called in those days. In Ada's new family, there was Ma's brother who worked in the dockyard at the marina, his old wife, a quiet, retiring woman who was a shadow to her autocratic husband, and their four mighty sons, all grown up. One was married with a young daughter, one was working as a clerk in the treasury, one was an artist who would stay at home and sing all day long. The youngest was at a finishing school. So Pa's death was a blessing to them, for it meant they could have Ada as an unpaid servant to help in this bulging household. All these people occupied only one room and a veranda, yet the house had 10 rooms. One could imagine the number of households that depended on the pump at Pike Street, for it served 8 other streets as well. It was always a case of first come, first served. By 7 or 8 in the morning, there were usual wife fights. Metal buckets were thrown in the air, fists drawn, and clothes torn. To avoid this rush hour, Ada was usually woken up at 4:30. Her being up so early was also a great help to her new pa and master. He went to work by 6:30 in the morning, and Ada had to be there to get him his odds and ends. One might think on this evidence that Africans treated their children badly. But to Ada's people and to Ada herself, this was not so at all. It was the custom. Children, especially white girls, were taught to be very useful very early in life, and this had its advantages. For instance, Ada learned very early to be responsible for herself. Nobody was interested in her for her own sake, only in the money she would fetch and the housework she could do, and Ada, happy at being given this opportunity of survival, did not waste time thinking about its rights or wrongs. She had to survive. Time went by quickly, and when she reached the age of 11, people started asking her when she was going to leave school. This was an urgent question because the fund for boys' education was running low. Ma was not happy with her new husband, and it was considered time that Ada started making a financial contribution to her family. This terrified Ada. For a time, it seemed as if she must give in to save Ma from the humiliating position she found herself in. She hated Ma for marrying again, thinking it was a betrayal of Pa. Sometimes she dreamt of marrying early, a rich man who would allow Ma and boy to come and stay with her. That would have solved a lot of problems, but the kind of men that she was being pushed to by her clever cousins and Ma's tactful hints were bald and huge, almost as big as her dead Pa. Ma had told her that older men took better care of their wives than the young and overeducated ones, but Ada didn't like them. She would never in her life get married to any man, rich or poor, to whom she would have to serve his food on bended knee. She would not consent to live with a husband whom she would have to treat as a master and refer to as sir, even behind his back. She knew that all Igbo women did this, but she wasn't going to. Unfortunately, her obstinacy gained her a very bad reputation. What nobody told her then was that the older men were encouraged to come and talk to her because only they could afford the high bride price Ma was asking. Since, however, she didn't know this, as soon as she saw one of those baldies in his white starched trousers, she would burst into native songs about bad old baldies. If that failed to repel them, she would go to the backyard and burst the bicycle tires of the suitors. She discovered later this was very bad indeed, because she had since learnt that the Nigerian government usually gave the junior clerks an advance for these bicycles. All the suitors were doing then was asking for the advance for their new Raleigh bikes with flashy lights in order to impress Ada. But the stupid girl refused to be impressed. The number of suitors did start to dwindle, though. Maybe word went round that she was a peculiar girl, for she did look funny in those days, all head, with odd-colored hair and a tummy that would have graced any Oxfam poster. She was subsequently told that they stopped coming because she was cranky and ugly. She did not dispute that. She was ugly then, all skin and bone. The thought of her having to leave school at the end of the year worried her so much that she lost weight. She acquired a pathetical, why anxious look, the type some insane people have, with eyes as blank as contact lenses. At about this time, something happened that showed her that her dream was just suffering a tiny dent, just a small one, nothing deep enough to destroy the basic structure. The dream had by now assumed an image in her mind. It seemed to take life, to breathe, and to smile kindly at her. The smile of the presence became wide as the headmaster of Ada's school announced the lists of available secondary schools which the children could apply for. You are going, you must go, and to one of the very best of schools. Not only are you going, you're going to do well there. Ada heard the presence telling her. She heard it so much that she started to smile. The headmaster's voice jolted her back to reality. And what is it about me that you find so funny, Otto Awfuleye? Me, sir? Oh, no. Sir, I was not laughing. I mean, not smiling, sir. You are not what? You mean I am lying? Well, back her up. Immediately, a group of 3 or 4 tough-looking boys came out from the back row, and the biggest of them all swept Ada onto his back, and 2 others held her feet, while the headmaster administered the cane on her posterior. The searing of the cane was so intense that Ada was beyond screaming. To ease the pain, she sank her sharp teeth deep into the back of the poor boy who was backing her. He started to scream loudly, but Ada would not let go, not even when the caning stopped. The boy wriggled in agony, and so did Ada. All the teachers came to the rescue. Ada's teeth had dug so deep into him that fragments of his flesh were stuck between her teeth. She quickly spat them out and wiped her mouth, looking at them all wide-eyed. You'll go to jail for this, the headmaster thundered, and he took the boy into his office for first aid. From that day on, no boy ever volunteered to back Ada up anymore, but that incident gave her a nickname which she never lived down, the Igbo Tigress. Some of her Yoruba classmates used to ask her what human flesh tasted like, because you Igbos used to eat people, didn't you? Well, Ada didn't know about the cannibalistic tendencies of her tribe. All she knew was that the headmaster's cane burnt her so much that she felt irrepressible urges to pass the pain to something else. Latifa, the boy who was doing the backing, happened to be the closest victim, so he had to take it. Ada also felt that she was being unjustly punished. She had been smiling at the presence, not the headmaster, and she suspected that the headmaster knew she was telling the truth. He had simply wanted to cane her. That was all. Otto waited for days for the law, which the headmaster said was coming to take her to jail. No policeman came for her, so she decided that she had either been forgotten or that her bite of Latifu was not deep enough to merit imprisonment. The thought nagged her, though. It nagged her so much that she was tempted to commit another atrocity, this time a really horrible one that nearly sent her not to jail, but to her maker. Otto was given 2 shillings to buy a pound of steak from a market called Sand Ground. She looked at the 2 shilling piece for a very, very long time. All she needed to take the entrance examination to the school of her dreams was 2 shillings. Didn't Jesus say that one should not steal? But she was sure there was a place in the Bible where it said that one could be as clever as the serpent, but as harmless as the dove. Would she be harming anybody if she paid for her entrance examination fee with this 2 shillings? Would Jesus condemn her for doing it? For stealing? After all, her cousin could afford the money, though he would not give it to her if she asked for it in the proper way. What was she to do? That was the trouble with Jesus. He never answered you. He never really gave you a sign of what to do in such a tempting situation. Anybody could twist what he said to suit his own interpretation. Then, she saw the image again. It was going to be all right, the image was. Smiling, so Ada buried the money and went back home in tears, without the meat. She was really no good at lying. The wildness in her eyes had a way of betraying her. If only she could have kept her large eyes lowered, it would have been all right. People would have believed her story. But she kept staring into their eyes, and her face showed her up like a mirror. "You're lying, Ada," her cousin's wife said, pointedly. Ada opened her mouth, but had to close it quickly because no sound came. She knew what was going to happen to her, the cane. She did not mind this caning because she knew that anybody who sinned must be punished. What she did not bargain for was the extent of the punishment. Her cousin sent her out with a 3-penny piece to buy the type of cane called the kiboko. It was the one the houses used for their horses. There was nothing Ada could do but buy it. Her cousin warned her that he would not stop administering the cane until she'd told him the truth. That was bad, thought Ada. She had to go to the Methodist Girls' High School or die. She concentrated her mind on something else. After the burning of the first few strokes, her skin became hardened, and so did her heart. She started to count. When Cousin Vincent had counted to 50, he appealed to Ada to cry a little. If only she would cry and beg for mercy, he would let her go. But Ada would not take the bait. She began to see herself as another martyr. She was being punished for what she believed in. Meanwhile, Cousin Vincent's anger increased. He caned her wildly, all over her body. After 103 strokes, he told Ada that he would never talk to her again, not in this world nor in the world to come. Ada did not mind that. She was, in fact, very happy. She had earned the 2 shillings. And he was a nasty, nasty man. The headmaster at her school did not believe his ears when Ada told him that she was going to sit for the common entrance examination. He looked at her kwashiorkor-ridden body for a very long time, then shrugged his shoulders. "One can never tell with you Igbos. You're the greatest mystery the good God has created." So he put her name down. Sometimes the thought that she might not be able to pay the fees crossed her mind. But she did not let that worry her. She had read somewhere that there was some sort of scholarship for the 5 or so children who did best in the exam. She was going to compete for one of those places. She was so determined that not even the fact that her number was 947 frightened her. She was going to that school, and that was that. But how was she to tell them at home? She had stopped liking Cousin Vincent. Every time she knelt down to pray, she used to tell God to send him to hell. She did not believe in that stuff of loving your enemy. After all, God did not like the devil, so why should she pray for the man who had the heart to cane her for a good 2 hours with a kiboko? When Cousin Vincent failed his Cambridge school certificate examinations, Ada burst out laughing. God had heard her prayers. The entrance examination was to take place on a Saturday. That was going to be very difficult. How was she to get away? Another lie? She could not do that again. She would be discovered, and they would stop her from taking the examination. So she told her uncle, Ma's brother, that she was going to sit for the examination. The funniest thing was that nobody even asked her where she got the money from. Nobody wanted to know. As long as she was not asking for money from anybody, and as long as she had done her Saturday job, she could go to the devil for all they cared. Occasionally, the mother of the house, Ma's sister-in-law, would ask how she proposed to get the money for the school fees and remind her that her father was dead. In response, Ada's mind would flutter with fear, but she never told anyone she was dreaming of winning a scholarship. That was too big an ambition for a girl like her to express. She was aware that nobody was interested in her since Pa died. Even if she had failed, she would have accepted it as one of the hurdles of life. But she did not fail. She not only passed the entrance examination, but she got a scholarship with full board. She never knew whether she came first or second or even third, but she was one of the best children that year. Since then, she had started to be overawed by the presence. It existed right beside her, just like a companion. It comforted her during the long school holidays when she could not go home because there was no home for her to go to. She was very happy at the Methodist girls' school, especially during the first 4 years. However, a cloud of indecision started to loom when her school days were coming to an end. It was incredible how quickly 5 years could pass. She would have liked to linger there, in the boarding house, to stretch each day into a year and each year into a century. But that was impossible. The final day came, and she was quite unprepared for life outside. She had some vague plans about what she was going to do. She was going to continue her education. She was going to go to a Ibadan university to read classics, and she was going to teach at the end of it all. Well, there was one thing she had not bargained for: to read for a degree, to read for the entrance examination, or even for more of levels. One needed a home. Not just any home where there would be trouble today and fights tomorrow, but a good, quiet atmosphere where she could study in peace. Ada could not find a home like that. In Lagos, at that time, teenagers were not allowed to live by themselves, and if the teenager happened to be a girl as well, living alone would be asking for trouble. In short, Ada had to marry. Francis was a very quiet young man who was reading to be an accountant. Ada congratulated herself on her marriage. At least he was not an old baldy, neither was he a made man then, though there was no doubt that he was going to be made one day. To Ada, the greatest advantage was that she could go on studying at her own pace. She got great satisfaction, too, from the fact that Frances was too poor to pay the £500 bride price Ma and the other members of her family were asking. She was such an expensive bride because she was college trained, even though none of them had contributed to her education. The anger of her people was so intense that none of them came to her wedding. That wedding itself was a hilarious affair. Frances and Ada were both underage, and the only witness, Frances's mother, had to sign with her thumb. The whole affair started off on the wrong foot. They had forgotten to buy a ring, and the skinny man with a black bow tie refused to marry them, even when Ada assured him that a piece of string would do until they got home. "I've never heard of such a wedding," the man declared, sweating in his tight collar. "Please marry us without a ring because, you see, before we can get to a Butte Meta, you will have closed for the day." Ada begged. "Never mind about that. You just come back tomorrow with a ring and I will marry you." They were married the following day. It was the saddest day in Ada's whole life. She did not mind having to go home in a bus, neither did she mind not marrying in white, which she hated anyway, but still she was sad, very sad, for months after the marriage at the register office. Soon, however, things improved. Ada gave birth to a daughter, and she and Frances were both delighted with the baby. Then, after endless interviews and form filling, Ada was selected to work as a librarian in the American Consulate Library at Campbell Street. The size of her pay packet worried Francis a little, and he had to ask his pa for advice. "Do you think our marriage will last if I allow Ada to go and work for the Americans? Her pay will be 3 times my own. My colleagues at work will laugh at me. What do you think I should do?" "You are a fool of a man, you are. Where will she take the money to? Her people? Her people, who did not even come to congratulate her on the arrival of baby Titi. Her relatives, who did not care whether she lived or died. The money is for you, can't you see? Let her go and work for 1 million Americans and bring their money here, into this house. It is your luck. You made a good choice in marriage, son. Francis was as delighted as a schoolboy. Otto would have to be protected, especially on the paydays. On the first payday, Otto was to be paid about £60 or so. Neither Otto nor Francis had ever seen such a fantastic sum. It was decided that Francis should work only a half day in his office and then take a bus to meet Otto in order to be a bodyguard for his wife and their money. Both husband and wife carried the money to Tinuba Square in Otto's work bag like a delicate baby. They talked about their plans for this sudden prosperity. We are ahead of all our colleagues, you know, Francis remarked. God is wonderful. Fancy me earning such a fantastic sum. Our new baby is going to be very lucky. If he happens to be a boy, we'll call him Kennedy. And if a girl, we'll call her Jacqueline. There was a long pause during which the young couple eyed a man in an Igbata robe suspiciously. Some of these rogues do smell money, you know, Francis whispered. Yes, I know, nodded Ada. Francis clutched the raffia bag tightly to his chest and frowned in the direction of the unsuspecting man. I've been thinking, Ada said, all of a sudden. I used to dream that one day I would go to the United Kingdom. Why don't we save and go, now that we shall be able to afford it? We can take our children with us. Everybody goes to the United Kingdom now. I'll be glad if we can go too. The smile on Francis's face was like a warm sunshine after a thunderous rain. It spread from ear to ear on his beardless face. He would be very happy if they could make it. He would finish his accountancy and Ada would read librarianship. He would go first, and Ada would send him £20 every month. She was to save for her fare and that of the children. She was to feed herself and the children whilst they were still in Lagos and pay the rent and help in paying the school fees of some of Francis's 7 sisters. Ada did not in the least mind being saddled with all these responsibilities, even though her bride price had not been paid. It never occurred to her to save her new high salary for her bride price. She knew that all she did would go towards making her young family into a family of Igbo elites, just like lawyer Nuiz of Abuja, who by then had become a minister in northern Nigeria. That lawyer was a funny man, Ada thought. He did not come to the south, to Abuja, to give the people of the town electricity, nor did he come to worship the river Oboshi. He just stayed put in the north, making barrels and barrels of money. When Ada was still at the American consulate, news appeared in the Nigerian papers that lawyer Nuiz was defending a Hausa multimillionaire. They said the millionaire was so rich that he had a railway line built right down to his palace door. The man had 8 Rolls Royces. After the case, Nuiz ended up a millionaire himself. Otis still wondered how that happened, because the millionaire was jailed for forging notes in his great palace. Francis and Ada sometimes wondered what he had paid Nuiz with. In any case, that was Nuiz's headache, not Ada Obi's. As far as she was concerned, her dreams were all coming true. Her marriage was less than 18 months old, yet she already had 4 maids. 2 were paid £3 each. The other 2 were paid their fees for secondary schools. These 2, Cecilia and Angelina, were Francis's sisters. These 4 girls did all the work in the house. All Ada had to do was to go to the American library, work till 2:30, come home, and be waited on hand and foot, and in the evening be made love to. She did not disappoint her parents-in-law on that score. For, apart from the fact that she earned enough money to keep them all going, she was very prolific, which, among the Igbos, is still the greatest asset a woman can have. A woman would be forgiven everything as long as she produced children. Ada was so fast on this score that she was given the nickname, Touch Not, among the other wives of her age group. As soon as her husband touches her, she gets a swollen tummy. They used to laugh. Later, in England, writing about that time of her life almost with nostalgia, she used to ask herself why she had not been content with that sort of life, cushioned by the love of her parents-in-law, spoilt by her servants, and respected by Frances's younger sisters. As for her mother-in-law, she was everything that Ma was not: quiet, beautiful, and motherly. Some of Ada's friends used to think that she was Ada's real mother. They were so close. But she suspected somewhere in her heart that the contentment she had then was superficial. She did not know her husband very well because, as most young African wives know, most of the decisions about their own lives had to be referred first to Big Pa, Francis's father, then to his mother, then discussed amongst the brothers of the family before Ada was referred to. She found all this ridiculous, the more so if the discussion involved finance. After all, she would have to pay for the plan in most cases, but the decision would have been made behind her back. Of course, Frances was simply a puppet in such cases, and so was she. They could not refuse. They had to bow down to their elders. Elders or no elders, they were going to live their own lives. It would have been fairer if some of the elders were from her own side of the family. But both Ada's parents were dead by then. Ma had died, aged 38, when Ada was in hospital having TT, so she felt cheated in a way. Cheated by the fact that neither her pa nor ma had lived to see any of her children, cheated by the fact that she was bringing so much joy into her husband's house and none into hers. Boy never visited her, neither did any of her cousins and uncles. They felt Ada had let them down. They said Ada should have continued her education and become a doctor, since she had managed to struggle through secondary school. But nobody talked of who was going to support her. Nobody talked of where she was going to live. So she found herself alone once more, forced into a situation dictated by society in which, as an individual, she had little choice. She would rather that she and her husband, whom she was beginning to love, moved to new surroundings, a new country, and among new people. So she said special prayers to God, asking him to make Pa agree to their going to the land of her dreams, the United Kingdom. Just like her Pa, she still said the name United Kingdom in a whisper, even when talking to God about it, but now she felt it was coming nearer to her. She was beginning to believe she would go to England. Frances broke the good news to her one day after their evening meal. Pa had agreed, he said. Ada was so full of happiness that she started to dance an African calypso. So they were going at last. She was soon going to be called Bintu, which was a Lagos phrase for those who had been to England. Frances allowed her to finish before he dropped the bombshell. You know how old-fashioned father is. Ada knew and nodded, startled by her husband's grave tones. Father does not approve of women going to the UK. But you see, you'll pay for me and look after yourself, and within 3 years, I'll be back. Father said you're earning more than most people who have been to England. Why lose your good job just to go and see London? They say it is, just like Lagos. Francis was an African through and through. A much more civilized man would probably have found a better way of saying this to his wife. But to him, he was the male, and he was right to tell her what she was going to do. Ada, from the day of her registry marriage, had seen the romantic side of her life being shattered, like broken glass, about her. Francis had had a very expensive education at Hussey College in Warri, but his outlook on life was pure African. He had had little opportunity of coming in contact with Europeans as Ada had, those God-forsaken missionaries. They had taught Ada all the niceties of life. They taught her by the Bible, where a woman was supposed to be ready to give in to her man at any time, and she was to be much more precious to her husband than rubies. It was all right for a man who had seen rubies before and knew their worth. What of a man who would throw rubies away, thinking that they were useless stones? What was she to do now? Cry? It was too late. Who were these people anyway? Illiterate parents who thought they knew a great deal of a curious kind of philosophy by which she was not going to bring up her children. There was no point in arguing with Francis. There was no need to ask him who he thought he was. He just would not understand. Be as cunning as a serpent, but as harmless as a dove, she quoted to herself. So she was to stay in Nigeria, finance her husband, give his parents expensive gifts occasionally, help in paying the school fees for some of the girls, look after her young children, and what then, rot? So this was where her great dream had led her. She should have married one of the Baldys. It was too late now. Not even a Baldy would have her. All she had to do was to change the situation, and that she was determined to do. She pretended to be all for the plan. Of course, she would stay in Lagos and look after the family. Of course, she would send him money regularly and, if possible, move in with her mother-in-law. Frances was not to worry about her at all. Everything was going to work out well. My father told me I made a right decision the day I said I was going to marry you. You know what he told me? No? I'll tell you. He said to me, Ada trained herself. She learnt very early to let her common sense guide her. She has the makings of a woman who would think before she acts. Very few women can do that, I tell you. They both burst out laughing. Father was right, was he not? Francis wanted to be reassured. Yes, your father was more right that he knew, Ada thought to herself. First of all, Francis must go. Then she would get down to work on her in-laws, and work on them very hard until they let her go. Plans for Francis's departure were soon underway. He got together everything he needed in no time at all. It cost Ada a small fortune, though, because it was bribery all the way through. To get a passport in those days, one had to bribe even the messenger at the passport office. Curiously enough, the office was manned by policemen. Even the man at the top, whose fee was £20, was a policeman. All his subordinates were paid £5 each. Francis and Ada lived on Francis's income and spent all Ada's on the preparation for his departure. The night before he left Nigeria, Francis took a group photograph with his family and Ada's little girl. Ada refused to pose for the photograph. She did not know why, but just did not wish to appear in it. Maybe it was because she was too big with the new child, but she knew the photographer could have cleverly disguised that. A relative of theirs came to make a special prayer to the river Oboshi. Some pieces of colonut were brought by Francis's mother, and these were broken by the relative. Then they were thrown into a circle on the floor, drawn with a chalk. A long prayer was sung to the goddess, who was 400 miles away in Abuja. She was requested to guide Francis, to keep him from the evil eye of white girls, to make him pass his examinations in good time, to bless him with all the money in England, to bless him with everything that was good in England. She was requested especially to forget him when circulating diseases and anything plaguey. This confused Ada. Was Oboshi responsible for the lives of people in England too? She wondered. In any case, at the end of it all, they were all ordered to eat the pieces of colonut, which they munched with great satisfaction. That was the trouble with being a believer in all these transcendent beings. One did not know when one aroused the anger of one or the other. For instance, did their chewing of the colonnuts offered to Oboshi automatically make them the enemies of Jehovah? Well, Ada debated with herself. Oboshi, being such a powerful goddess, might be able to protect them from the wrath of other gods. But Ada's being a Christian complicated the issue all the more. Didn't the God of the Christians, whom Ada believed in, tell Moses somewhere that he was a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me? That God would hate them for chewing those pieces of colonut, Otto was sure. Nothing would deaden her guilty conscience, not even the fact that her mother-in-law, who was devout Catholic, bought the colonuts, nor the fact that she was munching away happily herself. Otto looked at Francis, who carried the Bible every weekend, telling people the good news of the kingdom from a two-penny magazine called The Watchtower. Well, it was all right for her mother-in-law. She would quickly go to the padre, who lived round the corner at St. Paul's Church, and confess it all to him. The padre would then give her absolution. That would free her conscience to sin again, if she liked. As for Francis, he became a Jehovah's Witness whenever he felt like it, or when he could use it as an excuse for being selfish. When Otto was ill with their first baby, Francis had given his blood to save her life, forgetting that the witnesses were not supposed to do that. When he was busy with his preparations for coming to England, he forgot his watchtower and awake. He also forgot that coming to England was seeking after materialism, which he preached to Ada was not only evil but unnecessary, because Armageddon was round the corner. It was all right for them, but she did not know whom to turn to herself. There was no padre she could confess to in the church she attended. She belonged to the Church of England. They had nothing like Watchtower and Awake, neither had they any system of absolution. They left a guilty person with a nasty conscience. But wait a minute, she told herself. Didn't Jesus say to the Pharisees that one should give unto Caesar what was Caesar's and to God what was his? Well, that was what they were doing. She could quote the Holy Book to support it. There was nothing to worry about. The whole family turned out to wish Francis a safe journey at the airport at Acacia. When husbands left their wives for the UK, the wives were all supposed to cry from love. Ada prayed to God the night before to send enough tears to impress her parents-in-law. Those tears of hers had a way of coming down at the wrong time. She wanted them to flow at the airport so that when Francis became an elite, he would remember that poor Otto wept for him even when he was a nobody. Well, those tears did come, but at the wrong time. She watched Francis bid everybody goodbye, dry-eyed. All his sisters were like that Alice in Lewis Carroll's fantasy, weeping away like mad. He would remember them when he came back an elite, with strings and strings of qualifications. He will forget me and my child, and the other one I'm going to have in 3 weeks' time, Ada thought as she stood there, away from the clan, just like an outcast. Francis was disappointed and showed it, but he gave her a pat on the shoulder. Poor Ada, her heart ached for the departure of the only human being she was just beginning to understand, just learning to care for. Maybe the separation was too early in their marriage. She did not know. But what she did know was that there was this ache inside her heart, too heavy for tears, too heavy for words. She simply stared at them all. Everybody's name was being called, and all the passengers stood one at a time at the plane's door, waved the final goodbye to their folks, and then disappeared into the bowels of the whale-like monster they called the aeroplane. Ada had never seen an aeroplane at such close range. Why, they were bigger than buses. She thought. The air hostess was smiling unnaturally and waving two hands instead of one like everybody else. Why was that? Ada wondered. Then the door was cruelly slammed shut. The slamming of that door, the finality of it all, reminded her of something she had seen before. She had seen it all before, this cruel finality. The other person who was shut away from her like that never came back. Where did it happen before? She searched her memory as she stood in that scorching Nigerian sun. Then her mother-in-law moved towards her. Ada did not know what it was that drew that woman towards her in that burning sun. She touched Ada's unfeeling arm and said in a choked voice, "It looks like a coffin." Ada turned round, saw her, and started to howl. It all came back to her now. It was Pa who was nailed down into the bowels of a smaller whale, because he was going to be the only inhabitant of that one. This one was bigger, but it had the same aura of finality. Please God, it won't happen again. He is going to arrive there safely. Please God, let nothing bad happen to him, she cried. The relatives wiped their eyes and stared at Ada. What was the matter with her? Wives cried in the presence of their departing husbands, not when they had gone and could not see the tears. No one said anything. After all, she was going to provide the cash, so she was allowed a little eccentricity. The fact that someone so young could earn as much as Ada was enough to drive her to extremities, they said. Francis wrote from Barcelona and then from London. You did not cry for me, he accused Ada in his letters. You were very happy to see me go, were you not? Was that why you did not wish to appear in my send-off photograph? You did not care for me. Now, with what type of soap was Ada to wash herself clean of this dirty accusation? How was she to write to Francis and say, I cried for you? No, I even howled like a mad woman at the airport because the door of the plane reminded me of my pa's coffin. He would think she was mad. So Ada decided against it. She simply let sleeping dogs lie. She sent him money regularly, bore him another child. This time a son, went back to work 12 days afterwards, having had only 3 weeks annual leave. There was no provision for maternity leave at the American consulate then. But the staff had a big party for her, all American, all very rich and very nice. They knew what Otto was going through, but they were diplomats, not missionaries or social workers. A few months afterwards, Francis sent his wife and parents the results of his Part 1 examination. He had passed. So, for Ada, it was time to act, or she never would go to the land of her dreams. She was so happy about Francis's success that she babbled about it to everybody. She was not too surprised about this early success, considering that he had taken this same exam 4 times in Lagos before going to the UK. There were still the second and third parts, and the way Ada calculated it, Francis would stay another 4 or even 5 years. In one of his letters, he even mentioned his wanting to be articled. That would take 5 years at least. What was she supposed to do in the meantime? She wrote and asked Francis this, and was shocked to read from him that he would like her to come, but from her behavior at the airport, he was sure she did not care. Well, that was all she needed. She went to Frances's mother, appealed to her to look at all the women who had been to England, pointing out the fact that they all drove their own cars. Think of it, Ma Francis in his big American car and I in my small one, coming to visit you, and Pa when you retire. You'll be the envy of all your friends. Mind you, in England I'll work and still send you money. All you have to do is to ask, and then you'll get whatever you want. All the girls will go to secondary school. I've almost finished reading for librarianship. All I have to do is to work, look after Francis, and attend classes in the evening. And when I come back, I shall earn more than double what I'm earning now. Ada won over her mother-in-law. If going to England meant her earning more than she was earning now and riding a car as well, then she was all for it. Pa was still doubtful. He had suffered from unemployment when he was a young man and knew that the type of job Ada had then did not grow on trees. My going to England would be regarded as leave without pay. That softened Pa. The next problem was the children. Her mother-in-law sensed that if Ada took her 2 babies, she might never send the money she promised. Ada had a good solution for that. She was very fond of jewelry and had invested a small part of her income in this. She had several necklaces for her little girl and herself. She gave them all to her mother-in-law. You take them. In England, we shan't need them. And when I come back, I shan't be wearing gold anymore. Ada boasted with a fake smile on her face, whilst her heart sent her mother-in-law to her maker. She never asked Ada what she would be wearing when she came back from England. Diamonds, maybe. Mother in law was shocked all right, and before she could recover, Ada had had her kids immunized and paid for a first class passage by boat for the three of them. She was completely deaf to the warnings that she was paying over £200 more than was necessary for their passage to England. She was told to wait another 6 months, and she would get cheaper accommodation in cabin class. 6 months was too long a time to wait. Mother in law would change her mind. She was still not completely sure that her dream was coming true until she was on the deck of the Oriole, Vicky in her arms and Titi holding on to her skirt. It was then she saw her brother, Boy, in a brown African robe that was too big for him, crying and wiping his eyes with a velvet hat. Ada did not cry for the in-laws, and funnily enough, they did not cry for her. But all she needed to know was that a member of her own family was there, missing her. Boy was like Pa and Mom molded all into one, standing there. She cried too, this time not a howl, not an empty show, but tears of Rael. Sorrow at the thought of leaving the land of her birth, the land where Pa was buried and where Ma lay, quiet forever. Only she and Boy remained of that life which she had known. It was never going to be the same again. Things were bound to change, for better or for worse, but they would never be the same. Boy was now all alone. He had to work very hard to keep the family name going. Ada had dropped out of it. She had become an Obi instead of the awful eye she used to be. Boy had resented this, but his presence at the wharf showed that he had accepted the fact that in Africa, and among the Igbos in particular, a girl was little more than a piece of property. Ada had been bought, though on credit, and she would never go back to being an awful eye anymore. The tiny hands clutching her blouse were the hands of a big man in the making. Her duty was to them now. From now on, her children came first. All she could do for Boy was to make him aware that he had a sister he had every reason to be proud of. She might not come back a millionaire, but she would come back with pride. Ada wiped her eyes and waved to her brother, the distance between them lengthening so much that he soon became like a small black comma, and then he was gone. There was no time to wallow in self-pity. All around her were wives of diplomats and top white civil servants going home on leave. Life was changing fast. Being there, in the first-class section, seemed to give her a taste of what was to come. God would help Boy as he had helped her. She gave her children to the nurse and relaxed. It's nice to be treated like an elite, a status they were achieving. Had not Francis passed his first examination in cost and works accountancy, were not she and her children on their way to England? She knew she was determined that they would go to English schools and, if possible, English universities. She remembered what she had told her mother-in-law the very night before. We shall only stay a year and 6 months. The poor woman had believed her. That was life, she said to herself. Be as cunning as a serpent and as harmless as a dove.
Second Class Citizen, Chapter 3, A Cold Welcome.
There was a sudden burst of excitement on the deck of the ship. Ada could hear it from where she was sitting in her cabin, changing Vicky's nappy. For a moment, she stopped what she was doing, straining her ears to make out what the excitement was about, but she could hear nothing coherent. There were voices jabbering loudly, somebody laughed hysterically, and there were sounds of someone running as if chased by demons. What could it be? Wondered Ada as she hurried through the diaper routine. Perhaps it was a fire, or an accident, or could it be that they were drowning? She knew they would be in Liverpool in a day or two, but what was the rushing for? She was unable to bear the suspense any longer, so she quickly slipped a dress on and ran out onto the deck. She had forgotten that they had passed the Bay of Biscay. She had forgotten that they were now in Europe and that it was March. The cold wind that blew on her face as she emerged on the deck was as heavy and hurtful as a blow from a boxer. She ran back, with her arms folded across her chest, to get more clothes. Then she ran to the ship's nurse. The nurse had a fat face, small eyes, and a fat body. She was all smiles when she saw Ada, and her eyes were lost in creases. Have you seen it? She burbled. Have you seen Liverpool? It's too early and a bit dark, but we are in Liverpool. We've arrived in England. Ada opened her eyes wide and closed them again, still shivering. So they had arrived. She had arrived in the United Kingdom. Pa, I'm in the United Kingdom, her heart sang to her dead father. The nurse stared at her for a second, then dashed past her, anxious to spread the good news. Ada put on the woolies which she bought at Las Palmas. Then she ran out onto the deck. England gave Ada a cold welcome. The welcome was particularly cold because only a few days previously they had been enjoying bright and cheerful welcomes from ports like Takoradi, Freetown, and Las Palmas. If Ada had been Jesus, she would have passed England by. Liverpool was gray, smoky, and looked uninhabited by humans. It reminded Ada of the loco yard where they told her pa had once worked as a molder. In fact, the architectural designs were the same. But if, as people said, there was plenty of money in England, why then did the natives give their visitors this poor, cold welcome? Well, it was too late to moan. It was too late to change her mind. She could not have changed it even if she had wanted to. Her children must have an English education, and, for that reason, she was prepared to bear the coldest welcome, even if it came from the land of her dreams. She was a little disappointed, but she told herself not to worry. If people like Lawyer Nuiz and others could survive it, so could she. The Francis that came to meet them was a new Francis. There was something very, very different about him. Otto was stunned when he kissed her in public, with everybody looking. Oh my God, she thought. If her mother in law could see them, she would go and make sacrifices to Oboshi for forgiveness. Francis was delighted with Vicky. Just my image. I can now die in peace. What do you mean, die in peace? Ada challenged. Francis laughed. In England, people make jokes of everything, even things as serious as death. People still laugh about them. Yes. Ada was beginning to be scared. She looked round her wildly. There were hundreds of people rushing around, clutching their luggage and pulling their children, but it was not as noisy as it would have been had they been in Lagos. The whites she saw did not look like people who could make jokes about things like death. They looked remote, happy in an aloof way, but determined to keep their distance. These people don't look as if they know how to joke. You're lying. Francis, you're making it all up. English people don't joke about death. This separation of ours has made you bold. You've never in your life told me that I was lying before, Francis accused. Otto was quietened by the sharpness in his voice. The sharpness seemed to say to her, "It is allowed for African males to come and get civilized in England. But that privilege has not been extended to females yet." She would have liked to protest about it from the very beginning, but what was the point of their quarreling on the very first day of their meeting after such a long separation? It was a sad indication, though, of what was coming, but she prayed that the two of them would be strong enough to accept civilization into their relationship. Because if they did not, their coming would have been a very big mistake. After the tedious check by the immigration officers, they shivered themselves into the train. It sped on and on for hours. For the first time, Ada saw real snow. It all looked so beautiful after the grayness of Liverpool. It was as if there were beautiful white clouds on the ground. She saw the factory where Ovaltine was made. Somehow that factory, standing there isolated, clean and red against the snowy background, lightened her spirit. She was in England at last. She was beginning to feel like Dick Whittington. Francis had told her in his letter that he had accommodation for them in London. He did not warn Ada what it was like. The shock of it all nearly drove her crazy. The house was gray with green windows. She could not tell where the house began and where it ended because it was joined to other houses in the street. She had never seen houses like that before, joined together like that. In Lagos, houses were usually completely detached with the yards on both sides, the compound at the back, and the verandas in front. These ones had none of those things. They were long, solid blocks with doors opening into the street. The windows were arranged in straight rows along the streets. On looking round, Ada noticed that one could tell which windows belonged to which door by the color the frames were painted. Most of the houses seemed to have the same curtains for their windows. They all look like churches, monasteries, Ada remarked. They build their houses like that here because land is not as plentiful as it is in Lagos. I am sure that builders of the future will start building our houses like that when Nigeria is fully industrialized. At the moment, we can afford to waste land in building spacious verandas and backyards. We may never be as bad as this. Jammed against each other. Francis did not make any comment. There was no need. He opened the door into what looked to Ada like a tunnel. But it was a hall with flowered walls. It was narrow, and it seemed at first as if there were no windows. Ada clutched at Titi, and she in turn held her mother in fear. They climbed stairs upon stairs until they seemed to be approaching the roof of the house. Then Francis opened one door and showed them into a room, or a half room. It was very small, with a single bed at one end and a new settee which Francis had bought with the money Ada sent him to buy her a top coat with. The space between the settee and the bed was just enough for a formica-topped table, the type she had had in her kitchen in Lagos. "Are we going to live here?" she managed to ask. "Well, I know you will not like it, but this is the best I can do. You see, accommodation is very short in London, especially for Black people with children. Everybody is coming to London, the West Indians, the Pakistanis, and even the Indians, so that African students are usually grouped together with them. We are all Blacks, all coloreds, and the only houses we can get are horrors like these." Well, what could she say? She simply stared. She said nothing even when she learned that the toilet was outside, for flights of stairs down, in the yard, or when she learned that there was no bath and no kitchen. She swallowed it all, just like a nasty pill. In the evening, the other tenants returned from the factories where they worked. They all came to welcome her. Then, to her horror, she saw that she had to share the house with such Nigerians who called her madam at home. Some of them were of the same educational background as her paid servants. She knew she had had a terrible childhood, but still, in Nigeria, class distinctions were beginning to be established. "Oh, Francis," she wailed inwardly, "how could you have done this to us? After all, we have friends who, though they may be living in slums like this, still live apart from this type of people." "You could have tried, Francis. Look at your friend, Mr. Eek. When he knew that his wife was coming with their daughter, he made sure he moved away from this lot," she said aloud. "Sorry, but I was too busy. It's not bad. You can keep to yourself. You don't have to mix with them. You have your children to look after. You don't have to see them. You make it all sound so easy. I don't have to see them. You forget I have young children, and they will bring me into contact with the neighbors. You should have thought of that before. Have you no shame at all, or have you lost your sense of shame in this God-forsaken country?" "Oh, I wish I had not come. I wish I had been warned. I wish." "Why don't you stop wishing and face reality? It is too late now. We just have to make the best of the situation. I shouldn't start moaning if I were you. Don't talk to me. I don't want to hear. You could have got better accommodation if you had really tried. But you didn't try hard enough," Ada yelled. Francis's temper snapped. He lifted his hand as if to slap her, but thought better of it. There would be plenty of time for that if Otto was going to start telling him what to do. This scared Otto a little. He would not have dreamt of hitting her at home because his mother and father would not have allowed it. To them, Otto was like the goose that laid the golden eggs. It seemed that in England, Frances didn't care whether she laid the golden egg or not. He was free at last from his parents. He was free to do what he liked, and not even hundreds of Ottas were going to curtail that new freedom. The ugly glare he gave Otta made that clear. Then he spat out in anger. You must know, my dear young lady, that in Lagos you may be a million publicity officers for the Americans. You may be earning £1 million a day. You may have hundreds of servants. You may be living like an elite, but the day you land in England, you are a second-class citizen. So you can't discriminate against your own people, because we are all second class. He stopped to see the effect of his warning. He was happy to see that it had made an impression. Otta sat crumpled on the edge of the new settee, just like the dying Aisha in Rider Haggard's She. Francis went on, enjoying the rhythm of his voice. That man should have been an actor, Otta thought. He laughed. A joyless sort of laugh, dry and empty. I remember at one of your old girls' association meetings where that white lady, yes, I remember, she was from Oxford, wasn't she? I remember her telling you all that young women with your background should never in all your lives talk to bus conductors. Well, my darling, in England, the middle class black is the one that is lucky enough to get the post of bus conductor. So you'd better start respecting them. At first, Otta thought Francis hated her. This was his first opportunity of showing her what he was really like. Had she made a mistake in rushing into this marriage? But she had needed a home. And the immigration authorities were making it very difficult for single girls to come to England. You were allowed only as long as you were coming to join a husband who was already there. It was very bad, sad in fact. But even if she had nothing to thank Francis for, she could still thank him for making it possible for her to come to England, for giving her her own children, because she had never really had anything of her own before. They made it up that night, forgetting, in the intense disappointment and loneliness which was fast descending upon them like a gloomy cloud, that they were not supposed to have more children for some time. Ada did remember in the confusion that her nickname at home was Touch Not, but how could she protest to a man who was past reasoning? The whole process was an attack, as savage as that of any animal. At the end of it all, Francis gasped and said, Tomorrow you are going to see a doctor. I want them to see to this frigidity. I am not going to have it. When, days later, Ada discovered what frigidity meant, she realized that Francis had become sophisticated in many things. She kept all this to herself, though. There was no point in arguing with Francis. He was as remote as the English people Ada had seen at Liverpool. And the house where they now lived was a place in which one could not have a good family ding-dong in peace. What worried her most was the description, second class. Francis had become so conditioned by this phrase that he was not only living up to it, but enjoying it, too. He kept pressing Ada to get a job in a shirt factory. Ada refused. Working in a factory was the last thing she would do. After all, she had several, oh, and levels, and she had part of the British Library Association professional certificate, to say nothing of the experience. Why should she go and work with her neighbors who were just learning to join their letters together instead of printing them? Some of them could not even speak any English, even though it was becoming a colloquial language for most Igbos. To cap it all, these people were Yorubas, the type of illiterate Yoruba who would take joy in belittling anything Igbo. But Francis mixed with them very well, and they were pushing him to force her to take the type of job considered suitable for housewives, especially black housewives. This was all too much for Ada, and she recoiled into her shell, telling it all, as the Protestant hymn book says, to God in prayers. But, as usual, God had a funny way of answering people's prayers. An envelope arrived one morning telling her that she had been accepted as a senior library assistant at North Finchley Library, subject to certain conditions. She was so happy about this that she ran into the backyard where she hung out the baby's nappies and started to whirl round and round in a kind of Ebo dance. She was forced to stop suddenly because she was dizzy. She was unwell. She was, in fact, feeling sick. Then she remembered that first night. Oh, God help her. What was she going to do? Tell Francis in his present mood? He would kill her. He had started accusing her of all sorts of things. He had told her that he married her in the first place because she could work harder than most girls of her age and because she was orphaned very early in life. But since she had arrived in England, she had grown too proud to work. The news of the new job would have cheered him up, but not if it was coupled with the knowledge that another child was on the way when Titi was barely 2 and Vicky 9 months old, not when the two children were not yet out of nappies. Oh, God, what was she going to do? Francis would say she had invented the pregnancy to avoid work. Had he not taken her to see a female gynecologist the very next day because, as he said, no marriage succeeds without a good sex life? As far as he was concerned, marriage was sex and lots of it, nothing more. The doctor was very sympathetic towards Ada and guessed that she was frightened of another child. She was sent home equipped with all sorts of gadgets to prevent a baby that was already sitting there prettily. Oh, yes. Bubu was determined to come into the world, and nobody was able to stop him even though he chose a very unorthodox way of doing so 9 months later. Meanwhile, his mother went through hell. Ada felt very ill, but kept it quiet. Francis was dissatisfied and started shopping around outside for willing women. Ada was quite happy about this. She even encouraged him. At least she would have some peaceful nights. As she expected, Frances blamed her for the baby and was sure she would lose the job because there was to be a medical examination. Otto was scared about this, but she was determined to get that job. She put on her best skirt and blouse, the set she had bought from St. Michael's in Lagos. She had not been able to buy any clothes since she arrived in England, as all the money she had brought with her went on food. Francis would not work as he was studying, and he said this would interfere with his progress. Well, she put on this outfit, feeling great. She had not really dressed up for a very long time. Apart from making her feel good, the skirt and blouse covered the gentle bulge that was already forming. Being the third child, it showed early. She stopped panicking when she saw that the doctor was a man, and an old man at that. There was a woman sitting by him, though, a scribe or something, for she held a pen and paper and sat on a chair, as stiff as dry twigs. Ada ignored the latter and set to work on the old doctor. She beamed at him, charmed him, and even wanted to flirt with him. In short, the doctor got carried away and forgot to look at Ada's belly button, even though she was stripped to the waist. She got the job. Only God Almighty knew what happened to the poor doctor, especially as it was clear from the first month that she was pregnant and she inquired about maternity leave. Otto was sorry for him, but what could she have done? If she had not got that job, her marriage would have broken up, and that would have been very difficult because she did not yet know her way about. The fact that she was still laying the golden eggs stopped Francis from walking out on her. As before, her pay bound him to her, but the difference was that she now knew it. She had had to travel all the way from Lagos to London to find that out, and to discover another very weak point. She cared for Francis. She wanted him to make good. She hated to disappoint him. So, sorry though she was for making a fool of an old doctor, this was just one of those cases where honesty would not have been the best policy.
Second Class Citizen, Chapter 4. The Daily Minders.
Ada started work on the 1st of June. It was almost 3 months since she had arrived in the United Kingdom. She was so proud of her job and so happy on this particular June morning that she found beauty in everything. She saw beauty on the faces of her fellow passengers and heard beautiful sounds from the churning groans of the speeding underground train. Spring had come very late that year because it had been a long and bitter winter, and although it was June, the freshness in the air was like that of the first day of April. At Finchley Central, the train emerged from its underground tunnel into the open air like a snake from its hole. Ada let down the window and breathed in the cool, pure, watery air. It had rained the night before, and there was wetness everywhere. She saw the back gardens of many, many houses, gardens with flowers of many varieties growing in profusion, lupins and peonies, delphiniums, sweet peas, and columbines. The wonderful glow of alyssum on the verges of many garden paths gave a tidy edge to the carpet of green grass which seemed to cover the ground. The trees had burst into green, ceasing to look like the naked, dried up, juiceless old women they had reminded Ada of when she first landed in England. Now, everything was young, clean, moist, and full of juice. At the library, she was quickly taken under the wing of the chief librarian. She was a Czech, explosive in her welcome and very, very friendly. Mrs. Conrad was a wide lady, with wide hips, a wide waist, and a face like a flattened dough. She had fine lines around her eyes, and these lines deepened when she smiled, which was most of the time. Even her smiles were wide, displaying her creamy, even teeth. She seemed to have little time for makeup. Her brown hair was cropped, just like a man's used to be before the arrival of Jesus fashion. She left a handful of bulbous curls at the back of her head and another at the front. The latter had a funny way of collapsing onto her forehead, and she was forever pushing them back into their rightful place. The curls at the back just stayed there unperturbed, even when Mrs. Conrad shook with laughter. Her skirts were always gathered and homemade. She wore woolen gathered ones in winter and cotton gathered ones in summer. She was untouched by any passing fashion. Come tight skirts, wide skirts, come middies, minis, maxis. Mrs. Conrad always wore her gathered skirts. This, together with unusually tight blouses, gave her the look of an overblown ballet dancer. The other girls were assistants, very young with long, skinny legs. Most of them seemed to be all legs to Ada. Unlike their superior, they were all fashion conscious. They made Ada feel out of place, so she never really became too familiar with them. They made her feel inferior somehow, always talking of boyfriends and clothes. Ada would have liked to join in, for she was the same age, but she knew that if she opened her mouth, she would sound bitter. She would have told them that marriage was not a bed of roses, but a tunnel of thorns, fire and hot nails. Oh, yes, she would have told them all sorts of things. But why, she asked herself, must she spoil other people's dreams? So she preferred to listen and smile noncommittally. Soon she settled down to work. She hardly ever sat down, and this was purgatorial to her feet. Only God knew what the people of North Finchley did with all the books they borrowed. The queue sometimes stretched so far that some people had to stand outside waiting just to borrow books. This was a big contrast to the library she had worked in before. At the consulate, they had to bribe people to make them read fiction. They were only keen on reading textbooks in order to raise their status economically. No one bothered with fiction. But in North Finchley, the number of fiction readers was so staggering that Ada decided to emulate them. She, too, started to read the works of many contemporary novelists, and that helped her a great deal culturally. In her new job, she had to be very fast in filing books, in filing tickets, in making out readers' tickets, in tracing lost ones. And all the time she was forever saying, "Thank you, thank you," when she accepted the returned books, "Thank you," when she gave the tickets back, "Thank you," when she handed over new books. In fact, working at the North Finchley Library was more of a thank you job than anything else. All in all, Otto was happy she'd got a first class job. She was happy that her colleagues at work liked her. She was happy that she was enjoying the work. It was all right for her, being a first class citizen for the part of the day when she worked in a clean, central, why heated library. But what about her children? Who was going to look after them? Since it was nearing the end of the summer term, Frances did agree to look after them temporarily. While it was still news that she had got herself employed in a library, doing a first class citizen's job, Frances was prepared to look after their children, but soon her job was no longer news. Everybody accepted it with a sniff. Who is going to look after your children for you? Frances asked one day when she was tucking the babies into their settee bed. I can't go on doing it. You'll have to look for someone. I can't go on looking after your children for you. Ada spun round, aghast. She was not really surprised that Frances said this. She had known it was coming, but what she hadn't realized was the resentment over the children which was accumulating in Frances. She could sense the suppressed anger when he referred to them as her children, not theirs. In Nigeria, when children were good, they were the fathers, they took after him, but when they were bad, they were the mothers, taking after her and her old mother. Ada was frightened. She could feel their neighbors speaking through Frances. Their landlord and landlady were in their late 30s. They had been married for 10 years or more, but the wife had had no children. They had resented Francis's idea of bringing his children to England in the first place. They had warned him that it was going to be difficult for them, but left him alone when he told them that Ada had already paid for their fare. They consoled themselves with the fact that, after all, the children would not stay with their parents at Ashdown Street. They would have to be fostered. Most Nigerians with children sent their children away to foster parents. No sane couple would dream of keeping their children with them. So rampant was the idea of foster parents that African housewives in England came to regard the foster mother as the mother of their children. They say that in England, Nigerian children have two sets of mothers, the natal mother and the social mother. As soon as a Nigerian housewife in England realized that she was expecting a child, instead of shopping for prams and knitting little boots, she would advertise for a foster mother. No one cared whether a woman was suitable or not. No one wanted to know whether the house was clean or not. All they wanted to be sure of was that the foster mother was white. The concept of whiteness could cover a multitude of sins. This was all right for the Nigerian wife who, for the first time, was tasting the real freedom of being a wife. She was free from the hindering influences of her kith and kin. She was free to work and earn money. Any type of work would do: cleaning, packing goods in a factory, being a bus conductor, all sorts of things. The money she thus earned went partly to the foster mother, and the rest was blown on colorful outfits from some big department store. Most Nigerian wives would say that they had to send their children away because they lacked suitable accommodation for them, and there was a great deal of truth in this. But what they would not admit was that most of them were brought up in situations far different from the ones in which they found themselves in England. At home in Nigeria, all a mother had to do for a baby was wash and feed him, and, if he was fidgety, strap him onto her back and carry on with her work while that baby slept. But in England, she had to wash piles and piles of nappies, wheel the child round for sunshine during the day, attend to his feeds as regularly as if one were serving a master, talk to the child, even if he was only a day old. Oh, yes, in England, looking after babies was in itself a full-time job. This was difficult for a Nigerian wife to cope with, especially when she realized that she could no longer count on the help the extended family usually gave in such situations. So most Nigerian children born to the so-called students, were condemned to be fostered away. Everybody expected Ada to do the same. It came as a big surprise, therefore, when they realized that she was not making any attempt to look for a foster mother. And now Francis told her that he was not going to look after her children for her anymore. Things were difficult for Francis, too. He had never in all his life been allowed to make his own mistakes because he had never made his own decisions. He had always consulted his mother, his father, and his brothers. In England, he had to make do with his Nigerian neighbors. Ada guessed that they had laughed at him behind her back when she was at work. So she took a deep breath before replying. I thought we decided that you were to look after them until we got a nursery place. I thought. You mean you decided? You thought it all out, and then you tell me what I'm going to do. Everybody laughs at us in this place. No African child lives with his parents. It is not convenient. It is not possible. There is no accommodation for it. Moreover, they won't learn good English. They are much, much better off with an English woman. But you forget, Francis, that when we were young, we spoke Yoruba flawlessly, even though we are Igbos. We picked the language up at school and at play. That shouldn't be difficult. Our English, yours and mine, is not all that bad, Ada explained in her gentlest voice, aware all the time that she was not only arguing with Francis, but with all the other tenants in Ashdown Street. He considered this for a while and then replied, but they have no friends to play with. But they will have when they start at the nursery. I am sure they will. Otto was hoping for the impossible. It would be easier for a loaded camel to go through the eye of a sewing needle than for a child with two parents to get a nursery place. The waiting list was a mile long. Then the landlord started his intimidation. The children must leave the house. He even took it upon himself to advertise for a foster mother for them. Luckily, no one offered to take two black children, boy and girl, aged 9 months and 2 years respectively. The landlady sensed that Ada did not like it and left her alone. But the men persisted. Another couple, the Ojos, who had left their 4 children behind, advised Ada to send hers back to Nigeria. Everybody talked and speculated. The trouble was that Ada was like a peacock who kept wanting to win all the time. Only first-class citizens lived with their children, not the blacks. They were right, in a way. The housing conditions were so bad that for days she didn't see Francis at all. As soon as she arrived home from work, he would disappear for fresh air. The children had no amusements, and their parents would not let them out for fear they would break their necks on the steep stairs. They were hushed and bullied into silence so that the landlord and his wife should not be disturbed. When it rained, which was often, the nappies were dried in the same room. The second-hand heater they used always smoked. The Obis lived not as human beings at all, but like animals. To cap it all, after the day's work, Ada did not have sufficient space to sleep in. Francis was getting very fat, and their single bed was not big enough for him, let alone the pregnant Ada. So, usually, when she was not needed by her husband, she would squeeze in on the settee with her babies. At about this time, she met and became friendly with a Cockney girl called Janet. Janet was Mr. Babalola's wife. Her story was not only remarkable, but startling as well. Mr. Babalola had come to England, just like Francis and Ada, to study. But unlike Ada and Francis, he had been single and had a northern Nigerian scholarship. This meant that he had more money to spend because the northerners, unlike the overeducated southerners, would do anything to encourage their men to get really educated so that they could come home and obtain the jobs in the north, which were then going to the southerners. Mr. Babalola was, therefore, a very rich student. Rumor had it that he had a glossy flat and was always entertaining. This was no surprise to anyone who knew the Northerners. They liked to spend their money, to really enjoy what they had, and to them what they had was theirs only today, not tomorrow or the day after. Allah would take care of the future. That was certainly Babalola's philosophy of life. For some reason, however, the money for Mr. Babalola stopped coming. No one knew why. One thing was sure, he was not doing any studying, though he had come originally to read journalism. Word went round that he was getting poor. He could not maintain his old level of entertainment, so his friends of the happier days took to their heels. They stopped coming, and Babalola moved to a much more modest Ariashdown street in Kentish Town. It was at this time, when his funds were running low and he was desperately trying to convince his government that, given another opportunity, he would do well, that he met Janet. He was waiting impatiently at a telephone kiosk to make a call to one of his now elusive friends. He waited for what seemed ages, but the young woman already in the kiosk seemed to clutch at the receiver for hours. Many others came, got tired of waiting and left, grumbling. But Babalola waited. He was going to make his call, even if it took him all day. Started to drizzle and he was getting soaked to the skin, so he banged on the kiosk door and shook his fist at the girl to frighten her. Then he looked closer and saw that the girl was not phoning anybody. She was asleep, standing up. Babalola's first reaction was fear. Was she dead? He wondered. Then he banged harder, and the girl woke. He was so sorry for her that he took her home. Janet was pregnant. The father of her baby was a nameless West Indian. Her stepfather would not take her in unless she promised to give the child away. Her mother had died a year before, leaving her stepfather 7 young children to look after. Janet was the oldest, so she had been turned out of the house. She would not go to any social worker. All she would do would be to convince her that, at the age of 16, she was too young to keep her baby. But Janet wanted her baby. This story awakened the communal African spirit in Babalola. It never occurred to him that he was doing anything illegal, taking in a 16-year-old girl. On the contrary, Babalola started to entertain his few remaining friends with Janet. It never occurred to him that he might fall in love with her, that he might want to protect her, to make her his wife. At that time, Janet was being offered to any black man who wanted to know how a white woman looked undressed. Most of Ada's neighbors had had their sexual adventures with Janet. But soon all that changed. Babalola realized that Janet could get dole money for herself and her child, enough to pay the rent. Janet, not knowing where else to go and also, like Ada, coming to terms with Babalola's weaknesses, complied. Soon Babalola started to monopolize Janet. "You are not thinking of going straight with that thing you picked up at a kiosk?" his friends asked, astonished. Babalola said nothing, but gave orders to Janet to stop being liberal with his friends anymore. Janet, feeling wanted at last, glowed. Soon after her first baby, she became pregnant with her second, Babalola's. It was at this time that Otto arrived. They became friends straight away. Otto found Janet very intelligent and realized that the rumors about her sleeping around were not true. She only wanted a roof over her head so that she could bring up her little boy, Tony. He was then a noisy 18-month-old baby who was a good playmate for Titi. Otto told Janet about her troubles, and Janet confided in Otto. She suggested that Ada should look for a daily minder for her children until the nursery had vacancies for them. Even Babalola was willing to help. By now he had become unpopular with his friends because he refused to hand his fish and chips girl around. The search was really depressing. It reached a point where Ada had to start knocking on door after door. Things got even worse for her when Francis failed his summer examinations. He blamed it all on her. If she had not brought her children and saddled him with them, if she had allowed them to be fostered, if she had not become pregnant so soon after her arrival, he would have passed. Francis forgot that it had taken him 5 attempts to pass the first part, that he did not attend any lectures because he felt he could do better on his own, that he was always reluctant to get up early enough in the mornings. Luckily for Ada, Babalola heard of Trudy. She had two children of her own and agreed to look after Otta's two as well. Frances praised Trudy to the skies. She was clean, well dressed, and very friendly. Otta had not seen her yet because she usually worked late in the library, coming home at 8 o'clock most evenings. She would dress the children, and Frances wheeled them to Trudy's, which was just a block away, and collected them at 6, after Trudy had washed them and given them tea. That, at least, was the arrangement. After a few weeks, Otta noticed that Titi stopped talking altogether. This surprised Otta because Titi was a real chatterbox. She wondered what was happening and decided to take the children to Trudy herself. After all, she had carried them for 9 months, not Frances. Frances was happy about this because he claimed that his friends laughed at him when they saw him with his children in a pushchair. What struck Otta first was the fact that Trudy's milkman delivered only 2 pints every morning, even though she was given Otta's children's milk coupon. But Trudy told her that Otta's children took 3 pints a day and that her milkman delivered not the two Otta saw, but 5 pints every day. Otta said nothing, but started giving her children cereal before leaving for work. This meant extra work, but she would do all she could to bring Titi back to her old self again. Still uneasy, she started paying Trudy visits on her half days. She did not like what she saw. Trudy's house, like all the houses in that area, was a slum, a house that had been condemned ages ago. The backyard was filled with rubbish, broken furniture, and very near an uncovered dustbin was the toilet, the old type of toilet with faulty plumbing, smelly and damp. On the first day that Otto went, she saw Trudy's two little girls playing in the front garden. They both had red slacks and blue pullovers. Their long brown hair was tied with well pressed red ribbons. They were laughing and looked very happy. They swung something in the air, and Otto realized that Trudy's girls were playing with the spades and buckets that she had bought for her own children. Her heart burned with anger, but she told herself to stop behaving like the little Ebo tigress. After all, she had not stayed 5 good years at the Methodist Girls' High School for nothing. At least she had been taught to tame her emotions. Maybe her children were having a nap or something. She walked in and entered the sitting room. She saw Trudy, a plump woman with too much makeup. Her lips were scarlet, and so were her nails. The color of her hair was too black to be natural. Maybe it was originally brown like that of her little girls, but the jet black dye gave her whole personality a sort of vulgarity. She was laughing loudly at a joke which she was sharing with a man who was holding her at a funny angle. Ada closed her eyes. The laughter stopped abruptly when they noticed her. "Why aren't you at work?" Trudy gasped. "I was going to the clinic at Malden Road, so I thought I'd look in and see how you were getting on with TT and Vicky." There was a pause, during which Ada could hear her heartbeat racing. She was finding it more and more difficult to control her temper. She remembered her mother. Ma would have torn the fatty tissues of this woman into shreds if she had been in this situation. Well, she was not Ma, but she was Ma's daughter, and, come what may, she was still an Ebo. She screamed, "Where are my children?" "You pro." She stopped herself. She was about to call Trudy a prostitute, but was not sure whether the man watching them, with his flies open, was her husband or not. The man quickly excused himself, though, and Ada blamed herself for not completing her sentence. The man was not Trudy's husband. He was a lover, a customer, or a boyfriend, or maybe a mixture of both. Ada did not care. She wanted to see her children. Trudy pointed towards the door. Ada's eyes followed the pointing finger to the backyard. Yes, Ada could hear the faint voice of Vicky, babbling something in his own special language. She ran out and saw her children. She stood there, her knees shaking, and burst into tears. Vicky was busy pulling rubbish out of the bin, and Titi was washing her hands and face with the water leaking from the toilet. When they saw her, they ran to her, and Ada noticed that Vicky had no nappy on. They won't talk to us. The other day, I gave an ice cream to Titi, and she did not know what to do with it. They wet themselves all the time. Trudy went on and on like a woman possessed, talking nonstop. Ada bundled the children into their pushchair and took them to the children's officer at Malden Road. After all, Trudy was a registered baby minder, whatever that was supposed to mean. The children's officer tut-tutted a great deal. Ada was given a cup of tea and told not to worry too much. After all, the children were all right, weren't they? While they were still talking, Trudy arrived in floods of tears. She protested that she had only allowed them into the backyard that day because she had a stinking visitor who would not go. Had Ada not seen him? He wouldn't leave her alone. Of course, the children had wandered into the backyard. She wouldn't have the heart to put a dog there, to say nothing of little angels like Ada's kids. She was a registered daily minder, registered by the borough of Camden. If her standards had been low, she would not have been registered in the first place. Ada should ask Miss Sterling. Miss Sterling was the children's officer. She wore a red dress and rimless spectacles, the type academics in old photographs usually wore. She blinked a great deal. She was blinking now, as her name was mentioned. But she could not get a word in. Trudy was making all the running. As for Ada, she listened to Trudy destroying forever one of the myths she had been brought up to believe, that the white man never lied. She had grown up among white missionaries who were dedicated to their work. She had then worked among American diplomats who were working for their country in Nigeria, and since she came to England, the only other whites she had actually mixed with were the girls in the library and Janet. She had never met the likes of Trudy before. In fact, she could not believe her ears. She just gaped in astonishment. Trudy even went as far as to tell the children's officer that Ada's kids drank 5 pints of milk a day. She loved the children, she said, and to prove it, she made a grab at Titi, but the child recoiled, protesting wildly. Trudy was reprimanded, and she promised to mend her ways. She would never let the children out of her sight. 6 pounds a week was not easy to come by, especially for a woman who stayed at home all day. She babbled all the way home, telling Ada her whole life history and the history of her parents and her grandparents. But Ada could not stop thinking about her discovery that the whites were just as fallible as everyone else. There were bad whites and good whites, just as there were bad blacks and good blacks. Why then did they claim to be superior? From that day on, she took everything Trudy said with a pinch of salt. Francis told her not to worry. Even if the children were left in the backyard, he was sure it must have been clean before the kids messed it up. Instead, he told Titi and Vicky to be good children and never go near the rubbish dump again because dustbins were dirty. The babies just stared at him. Then he told Titi that if she did not keep herself dry, he would beat her with his belt. But how was Titi to obey an order that she did not understand? In Nigeria and on the boat, she was a noisy toddler, talking and singing in Yoruba like all her little friends. Ada was teaching her English sentences and sometimes read her nursery rhymes, of which Baba, Black Sheep, was her favorite. But now she simply refused to talk. Ada worried so much about it and spoke to God about it in her prayers. Then one day a friend and classmate of hers came to visit them. Not having anything to give her, Ada decided to make her a bowl of custard. When her back was turned, the friend started to tease Titi in Yoruba, encouraging her to talk. Tired of Titi's silence, Ada's friend snapped at Titi. Have you lost or sold your tongue? You used to talk to me in Nigeria. Why don't you talk to me now? Then Titi, the poor thing, snapped back in Yoruba. Don't talk to me. My dad will lash me with the belt if I speak in Yoruba. And I don't know much English. Don't talk to me. Ada was so startled that she spilled the hot custard she was making. So that was it. Francis wanted their daughter to start speaking only in English. This was due to the fact that Nigeria was ruled for so long a time by the English. An intelligent man was judged by the way he spoke English. But it did not matter whether the English could speak the languages of the people they ruled. This convention had a terrible effect on little Titi. She later overcame her difficulty in speaking, but she was well over 6 years old before she mastered any language sufficiently well to be able to converse intelligently. That early confusion retarded her verbal development a great deal. But, thank God, it did not land her in one of those special schools for backward children. After that revelation, Auda started nagging Miss Sterling to find a nursery place for her children. But, as every young mother who tried to place her child in a nursery could testify, there was no place for the children. She had to make do with Trudy, aware all the time that the kids still played in the backyard and that Vicky's nappies were never used, but soaked in water so that they looked used. She prayed to God about it and hoped nothing horrid would happen to the kids. God was either tired of answering her prayers or wanted to teach Otto a lesson. For something horrid did happen, not to Titi, but to Vicky.
Second Class Citizen, Chapter 5, An Expensive Lesson.
One beautiful morning in July, Otto woke up very tired. There were many possible reasons that could have accounted for her fatigue. Their living conditions, cramped together in one half room, her constant worry about the way Vicky and Titi were being treated, her pregnancy. To cap it all, she and Francis communicated only in monosyllables, and then only when the conversation was very necessary. She started to lose faith in herself. Had her dream of coming to the United Kingdom been right after all, or was she simply an empty dreamer? But Frances had agreed to it in the first place. Where had she gone wrong? She wished the presence was still with her to give her a clue, but it seemed to have deserted her when she landed in England. Was the presence her instinct? It had been very active in Nigeria. Was that because in Nigeria she was nearer Mother Nature? She only wished somebody would tell her where she had gone wrong. With this heaviness, which was like the heavy load of Christian in the Pilgrim's Progress, she got up reluctantly. She looked for a minute or two at her husband snoring away, his hairy chest going up and down like troubled waves. She felt like shaking him to tell him how tired she was feeling and how reluctant she was to leave the house and the children that day, but she knew that he would not listen in the first place, and that even if he listened, he would dismiss her feelings as mere superstition, just like Caesar dismissed his wife's dream about the Ides of March. She got herself dressed, washed the children, and gave them breakfast. The clatter of the plates and Vicky's crying woke Frances eventually. What's all this noise about so early in the morning? Can't I even have an 8 hours sleep in peace? Frances demanded angrily. Vicky won't have his Rice Krispies. I don't know what the matter is with him this morning. He isn't hot or anything, just raging with temper. Nothing, Ada explained. Francis looked at his son for a while. Vicky stood in the middle of the room with his mouth pouting in determined anger and his bib dripping with milk. Francis sighed and was on the verge of turning over to face the other side of the bed when Ada said, I feel so heavy this morning and have no appetite either. Could you please take the children to Trudy for me? I'm late as it is. Oh, God, groaned her husband. Will you take them for me? Ada pleaded. Have I any choice? Francis wanted to know. Such questions did not need answers, Ada decided within herself, but she was annoyed nonetheless. Could Francis not have asked her how she was feeling or something? Would that be too much to ask? She wondered. She told herself to stop being over-romantic and soft. No husband would have time to ask his pregnant wife how she was feeling so early in the morning. That only happened in true stories and true romances, not in real life, particularly not with Francis, for that matter. But despite the hard talking to herself, she still yearned to be loved, to feel really married, to be cared for. She was beginning to understand why some young wives went to the extent of being unfaithful just to make themselves feel human, just to find another human being who would listen to their voices, who would tell them that it was going to be all right. Frances was only good at giving her children, nothing else. She felt vengeful. She left the breakfast things uncleared, did not change Vicky's dripping bib, did not wipe the milky mouth. She simply pulled out her bag from the jumble of children's clothes and walked to the door, about to leave. Then Vicky, seeing his mother was leaving him, started to cry. In his hurry to grab her skirt, he tipped more milk onto the carpetless floor. Otis smiled inwardly. Frances was going to have a busy day. She picked Vicky up, cooed to him reassuringly, and kissed him. But Vicky would not let her go. He held on to her tightly. That was odd, thought Ada. Vicky was a contented, fat baby who normally just said bye-bye to Ada most mornings. But not today. Ada sat down again and cuddled him, sang to him, and then the bye-bye came. A tearful one, a reluctant one. He walked to the door, this time clutching at a teaspoon, still wearing the dripping bib. As for Titi, she was past caring. She seemed scarcely aware of all the goings on around her. She seemed to have resigned herself to the inevitability of it all. She seemed to tell her little self that her crying would not change anything and she must accept things as they were. Ada's pay at work was just enough to pay the rent, pay for Francis's course, his examination fees, buy his books, and pay Trudy. They had little left after this, and so it was impossible for Ada to have lunch at work. She usually took a boiled egg with her, instead of having it in the mornings for breakfast. But sometimes she got bored with having just a boiled egg and the coffee provided in the library, and she ate nothing. On those occasions, she felt that type of hunger which she thought she had outgrown. The hunger that held the two sides of one's stomach and squeezed them so tightly that the owner of the stomach felt like passing out. Sometimes her stomach would whine and rumble in its agony. These mumbling sounds in Ada's stomach used to embarrass her no end. It was all right in Nigeria, when she was a servant and an orphan, but it was uncomfortable when she was a woman in her own right and a mother of two. She sensed that the hunger pangs were about to start during her lunch break, so she decided to go for a walk instead. It was wet outside, and the staff room was cozy and warm. The girls had already sat down and were talking of their conquests and, as usual, about marriage. She was beginning to agree with them that some marriages could lead to happiness, because the girls talked of nothing but the happy ones. Well, hers was not happy, though she still believed that a happy marriage was an ideal life for a girl. One of the girls, Cynthia, was engaged to be married and was sure hers was going to work. Ada had agreed with her so many times that she was no longer in the mood to listen to her happy chatter that day. Cynthia would notice her rumbling stomach and offer her some food and ask her if she was all right and all that, so she would go for a walk. She usually walked along Finchley Road, looking at all the restaurant windows she passed. She used to tell herself that, when Frances qualified and she had become a librarian, Frances would bring her to such places to eat. She sensed that, in her case, it was an empty dream. Even if Frances did qualify, he would never have the courage to bring her to a restaurant to eat, not in London anyway, because he firmly believed that such places were not for blacks. Ada knew that his blackness, his feeling of blackness, was firmly established in his mind. She knew that there was discrimination all over the place, but Frances's mind was a fertile ground in which such attitudes could grow and thrive. Personally, if she had had the money, she would have walked straight into such places and was sure she would have been served. But what was the point of her dreaming about it? She had no money. So she feasted her eyes on the well-displayed food. One particular item attracted her that afternoon was a fish cake in a fish shop. The cake was yellowish-brown all round and very appetizing. Her mouth started to water like that of a starving dog, so she turned away. The uneasiness she had felt early in the morning seemed to descend on her again with such force that she felt she was going to choke. For no reason whatsoever, she started to hurry back to the library. When she reached it, she would have a drink and a rest before going back to work. Thank goodness it was one of her early days. She would be finished by 5. She met Cynthia at the front door of the library, struggling hurriedly into her light summer raincoat. Thank God you are here. I was just going to look for you. My children. What's happened to them? Are they all right? How did you know? Cynthia asked, frightened. Who told you? She went on asking as she trotted behind Ada into the library. Yes. How had she known? How could a mother tell another woman who had never given birth to a baby that sometimes she lived in her children? How could she explain that if her son underwent an operation, her own body would ache? How could Ada tell Cynthia that when she was looking at the fish cake, she had seen Vicky's wet face, twisting in pain, reflected in the window? There was too much to explain, too much about herself as a human being that she did not know. She just felt these things. Ada did not cry. Victor was in danger, but not dead, and as long as he was alive, God would help him. You haven't heard the message? The other assistant commented. Then Ada got the message she had already sensed. Trudy had phoned. They said Vicky was very ill and she couldn't send him to a hospital because she was waiting for Ada to come home. Mrs. Conrad, God bless her, drove her to the station. Ada ran from Kentish Town Station to Trudy's house. There was an ambulance waiting outside the door. A small crowd had already gathered, talking, arguing, and conjecturing. They all knew Ada. They'd seen her bring her children to Trudy's many a time. Titi looked at her pathetically as she ran past into Trudy's sitting room. Trudy was holding Vicky, wiping his face with a rag as filthy as an old mop head. She dipped the rag in a bowl of equally filthy water and rubbed it all over Vicky's face. She said she was cooling his temperature. A big bald doctor stood there, his bag in his hand. The Indian doctor with whom Francis and Ada had registered was too busy to come, and the big bald fellow in black three-piece suit was his locum. He stood there, this doctor, looking at Trudy's ministrations objectively, as if they were no concern of his. When Ada came in, Vicky lifted a hand and called his mother. He still knows me, Ada thought, as she scooped him up from Trudy. She held him tightly, as if by doing so she could breathe health into the sick boy. What is the matter with him? She asked, first the doctor and then Trudy. Getting no answer, she turned to Miss Sterling, who just stood there wringing her hands. If they knew what the matter was, they were not going to say. The ambulance is waiting. You'll find out in good time. Meanwhile, we have to get him to hospital as quickly as possible, the doctor ordered. Though there was an urgent tinge in the doctor's voice, by Ada's calculation, Vicky was not very ill. He was hot, running to 101 in body temperature, yet Ada did not feel that there was any need to panic. She was thinking that Vicky probably had a bout of malaria, which to her was just like a common cold. Malaria would make a child's temperature run high, and it would go down as soon as the child was given Nivaquine. In fact, if Vicky had had the attack at home, that was what she would have done. As far as she knew, judging from the experience she had with Titi, children suffered only from malaria. Why all the panic then? She wondered. Any mother could cure a child of malaria without phoning the ambulance men or calling the doctor, who simply stood there, ready as if for nothing but to sign a death certificate. Vicky, say bye-bye to Trudy, she said as they made their way to the door. Vicky waved bye-bye weakly and also sang it, in his peculiar way. They all, Trudy, Miss Sterling, and the doctor opened their mouths as if to tell her that the baby was too weak to talk. But they kept quiet when Vicky talked. Ada felt triumphant. Her son was simply running a high temperature, that was all. He was not dying, so they might as well get used to the idea. She felt like Jesus, who amazed his dumbfounded disciples when he said, "Lazarus is not dead, he sleepeth." The big doctor saw through her agony, her fear, and touched her shoulder gently as she was about to step into the street. "Your little son is very ill. I don't know what it is, but I am sure they will do their best for him at the Royal Free Hospital." Ada thanked him, but she was determined not to be made unhappy, not to be talked into expecting the worst. "I think I know what the matter is," she boasted. "I think it is malaria. Children do have it at home, you know, just as you have common colds. This may not be malaria, you know," the doctor cautioned as he and the ambulance men helped her into the ambulance. To her that morning, what could be so wrong as to merit an ambulance and a doctor? In Lagos, one had to be either a millionaire or a relative of the doctor's to warrant his visit. He wouldn't come just for a child running a high temperature. Now an ambulance was speeding her to the Royal Free, just for that. Why was the name of the hospital Royal Free? Was it a hospital for poor people, for second class people? Why did they put the word free in it? Fear started to shroud her. Were they sending her Vicky to a second class hospital, a free one, just because they were blacks? Oh, God, what had she let herself in for? They might even use her child's organ to save the life of another child, who would probably be white and rich, and who would be admitted into a hospital that had no free in it. A paying hospital. Ada did not then believe in anything good coming from something you did not pay for. She viewed anything free with suspicion and reluctance. In Nigeria, you paid for your treatment. The fatter your purse, the more intensive your treatment. She had never seen or heard of a place where a child was given such close attention by adults, free. There must be a catch somewhere. By the time they arrived at the hospital, she was convinced Vicky's innards were going to be taken away from him. The thought had got such a hold of her that she at first refused to let him go. Two nurses held her and took her into a small room with soft chairs lining the wall. They made her a cup of tea, with plenty of sugar in it. She drank it greedily with thanks, enjoying the taste of sugar, which she hated normally. She had hardly ever had sugar because African mothers thought that sugar and meat caused worms. She had later come to like eating meat, but she never really acquired the taste for sugar. But on that day at the Royal Free, she was too hungry to care. She did enjoy the tea and was told to wait while Vicky was being examined. She waited and waited until she nearly fell asleep. Then she started to worry about Titi. She hoped Francis would remember to go for her. It was funny, really. She hadn't thought of looking for Francis. She did not want him to be worried. It wasn't anything serious. As far as Francis was concerned, she was still at work, and Vicky was at Trudy's. Something kept telling her that she should let her husband know. But how could she when she didn't know where he would be at that time of the day? He had stopped attending regular lectures and just read on his own. That meant he could be in any library in London, or he could be with any one of his girlfriends. Otto was the last person to disturb him if he were busy with any of these preoccupations. She would tell him everything when she got home. The nurse and two young doctors came to her. They told her that Vicky was very ill, but they'd taken all sorts of samples from him, and until they got the results, they could not treat him. They would keep him under observation in the hospital. To Ada, hospital usually meant two things: where you go for your baby to be born, or where you go when you're about to die. The first time she had been admitted to a hospital was when she was going to have TT. The only other person in her family she knew had been in a hospital was Pa. He had gone for a checkup and never came back. These thoughts chased each other through her mind as she tried to think of the right decision to make. She sensed, somehow, that she had little choice in the matter. Vicky had already been allocated a room, an isolated room, in case his illness was contagious. She was allowed to go in and see him. He had been tucked in nicely, in a blue cot with blue fluffy blankets. He was not asleep, but stared at his mother as somebody having a bad migraine might. It seemed as if he found it difficult to move his eyes. Could they be right after all? Was Vicky very ill? She clutched the railings of the cot. She was being watched through the glass partition. A nurse came to her and told her that it was time for her to go. Vicky needed rest and sleep. Ada nodded and said goodbye to him, but Vicky did not answer. His tired eyes seemed to be gazing at something which only he could see. Ada was not allowed to linger. She had to go. Why, she thought to herself, didn't the authorities permit the mothers of young babies to stay with their sick offspring in hospital? In Nigeria, where the weather was warm enough, she could have stayed outside the hospital, under a big tree in the compound. Now she didn't know what she was going to do. Wait in the corridor. They would shoo her off. But until then, that was what she was going to do. Fancy admitting a year-old baby into a hospital and not giving him any treatment because they were still diagnosing the symptoms. Suppose the child was seized by convulsions, as her children used to be when they ran a high temperature. The nurses would only pump injections into him, but she had seen babies suffer from these malaria seizures all through her life and knew all the first aid cures. The hospital might not, so she would stay. Ada dozed off on a wooden bench. When she opened her eyes, she was surprised to see the beautiful nurse with the soft voice who had told her previously that it was time to go. She looked at Ada for a long time and then smiled. Is Victor your only child? Ada shook her head. Vicky was not. There was another, but she was only a girl. Only a girl? What do you mean by only a girl? She is a person, too, just like your son. Ada knew all that. But how was she to tell this beautiful creature that in her society she could only be sure of the love of her husband and the loyalty of her parents in law by having and keeping alive as many children as possible, and that though a girl may be counted as one child, to her people a boy was like four children put together? And if the family could give the boy a good university education, his mother would be given the status of a man in the tribe. How was she to explain all that? That her happiness depended so much on her son staying alive. Do you know, I'm making another one, she volunteered, to show the nurse how good a wife she was. The nurse, who either did not understand, or whose idea of a good and valuable wife was different from Ada's, nodded but said nothing. If Ada did not go, they would send for her husband, she said. She had to go. Ada said she would only go if they used force, and so long as they were not going to do that, she was going to stay. But she went down to the corridor below and watched some West Indian housewives coming to do their cleaning jobs. Later that night, Francis came. Titi was spending the night at Trudy's, so he had come to look for her. For a while, it seemed as if Vicky's illness might bring the parents together again. Francis did not tell her not to worry, because he did not know how to do such things, how to be a man. Instead, he cried, like a woman with Ada. 3 days later, it was discovered that Vicky had viral meningitis. So Ada read all about this horrible thing, with its horrible, unpronounceable name, in the library. She studied the causes and knew all the effects. But where did he get it from? We never heard of such things in my family, and I never heard Mom mention it to me in your family either. Where did he get it from then? I want to know, because I'd like to prevent it in future, if he has any future, that is. They cure everything here, Francis replied, gazing into space. His chances of surviving are very slim from the statistics I checked in a medical encyclopedia. I want to know where my son got this virus from. The medical books say he must have taken it through his mouth. I am very careful with Vicky and have not made as many mistakes as I did with TT. I want to know where he got it from, and look, Francis, I don't care what you think anymore. I am going to find out. From Trudy. What's come over you? He demanded, not believing his ears. What's happening to you? You want to know what's happening to me? I'll tell you. You will have to know sooner or later. If anything happens to my son, I am going to kill you and that prostitute. You sleep with her, do you not? You buy her pants with the money I work for, and you both spend the money I pay her when I go to work. I don't care what you do, but I must have my children whole and perfect. The only thing I get from this slavish marriage is the children. And Francis, I am warning you, they must be perfect children. Francis looked at her, as if with new eyes. Somebody had warned him that the greatest mistake an African could make was to bring an educated girl to London and let her mix with middle class English women. They soon know their rights. What was happening to them? Francis wondered. In their society, men were allowed to sleep around if they wanted. That gave the nursing mother a break to nurse her baby before the next pregnancy. But here in London, with birth control and all that, one could sleep with one's wife all the time. But he was not brought up like that. He was brought up to like variety. Women at home never protested, and Ada had said that she did not mind. But feeling the intensity of her anger, he sensed that she did mind. No man liked his freedom curtailed, particularly by a woman, his woman. He would not argue, he would not beat her into submission because of the baby, but he was not going to be tied to Ada, either. Why? In bed, she was as cold as a dead body. Ada was still talking. She was going to Trudy. She was going to get the truth from her if it killed her. God help you, Francis said. This is not home, you know. You can be jailed for accusing her falsely. You will be in trouble if you go and fight a woman in her own home, you know. After all, she is keeping Titi for us. Yes, I know she is keeping Titi so that you can pretend to go and see her at 11 o'clock every night. Last night you left at 11, and you did not come back until I was ready for work. Seeing Titi. An uncomfortable pause followed, during which Ada seemed to be weighing up her new freedom. After all, she earned the money in the family. She continued, in a strange, threatening way. If she does not give me a good answer, I shall bring Titi home with me, and I am not leaving this house to work for you until the kids are admitted into the nursery or you agree to look after them. I don't care what your friends say. I am going to Trudy. She has something to tell me. You're just like your mother after all. That quarrelsome troublemaker. People say women grow up to be like their mothers. But unfortunately for you, you're not as tall and menacing as she was. You're small, and I'm sure Trudy will teach you a lesson or two. We'll see, Ada replied as she dashed out of the house in a rage. They said at the hospital that Vicky had viral meningitis, and he is still on the danger list. I want to. Ada began, but Trudy cut her short. Yes, I phoned the hospital and they told me that. So I told them that you had brought him to London only a few months ago. He could have caught it from the water you drank at home, you know, before you brought him here. Ada stared at her. She could not believe her ears. Was she dreaming? What was it Trudy was saying about the child she had had in the best hospital in Nigeria, in the best ward, under the most efficient Swiss gynecologist that the Americans could get for her as a member of their staff, which was one of the innumerable fringe benefits attached to working for the Americans? She wanted to explain all this to Trudy, but at that moment she saw TT coming in from the backyard, as filthy as the last time. Ada never knew what came over her. All she knew was that she lost control of the situation. Kaleidoscopically, her inner eye kept seeing Vicky and Titi in the rubbish dump in Trudy's backyard. She could not eradicate that picture rotating in her mind, and she did the only thing that came to her instinctively. In front of her was an enemy, insulting her country, her family, her person, and, worst of all, her child. Somebody had left a carpet sweeper by the door. Ada later wondered why this was so, because there was no carpet in either of Trudy's two rooms. Without thinking, she picked it up, heavy as it was, and banged it blindly in the direction of Trudy's head. Trudy saw it coming and dodged. Somebody, another neighbor of Trudy's who was standing in the doorway, held Ada from the back. Don't do that. This neighbor's voice came from behind her, cool, rational, reassuring. Ada spat, foaming at the mouth, just like the people of her tribe would have done. Among her people, she could have killed Trudy, and other mothers would have stood solidly behind her. Now, she was not even given the joy of knocking senseless this fat, loose fleshed woman with dyed hair and pussycat eyes. She belonged to the nation of people who had introduced law and order. Her tummy began to ache, just like the onset of indigestion. Otto was not used to bottling up her anger. Why, hadn't Pa told her that it was bad for the system? So, to let off steam, she threatened, I am going to kill you. Do you hear that? I am going to kill you. If anything happens to my child, I shall sneak in here and kill you in your sleep. If not, I'll pay people to do it for me, but believe me, I am going to kill you, and with a smile on my face. I saw Vicky with my own eyes in the rubbish dump. I smelt of you through my husband. I pay you with the money I earn. Let my husband sleep with you. And then you want to kill my son. Then Autumn broke down and started to cry, her voice coming out strangled and harsh, like that of somebody being tortured. The other white women stood there looking at her, shocked. They had probably never seen an angry Igbo woman. If they were surprised, Ada was more than that. She was horrified at her own behavior. She could not control herself anymore. She had had so many things to bottle up inside her. In England, she couldn't go to her neighbor and babble out troubles as she would have done in Lagos. She had learned not to talk about her unhappiness to those with whom she worked, for this was a society where nobody was interested in the problems of others. If you could not bear your problems anymore, you could always do away with yourself. That was allowed, too. Attempted suicide was not regarded as a sin. It was a way of attracting attention to one's unfortunate situation. And whose attention do you attract? The attention of paid listeners. Listeners who make you feel that you are an object to be studied, diagnosed, charted, and tabulated. Listeners who refer to you as a case. You don't have the old woman next door who, on hearing an argument going on between a wife and husband, would come in to slap the husband, telling him off and all that, knowing that her words would be respected because she was old and experienced. Instead, you have the likes of Miss Sterling, whose office was along Malden Road in front of Trudy's house. Mercifully, somebody had called her, and she arrived, breathing hard and blinking furiously. She listened patiently to Ada's story and appeared to agree with her, but said nothing about it. Instead, she was quiet for a while as Ada looked round at these strange people. Nobody blamed her or Trudy. No speech. Ada felt like a fool. She was learning. People here do not tell everything. They don't say things like, I even allowed my husband to sleep with her as part of the payment. She noticed one thing, though. Trudy looked as if somebody was forcing her to eat shit. Her mouth went ugly, and her eye makeup was running in streaks all over her face. Even her black hair showed some strands of brown. Then Miss Sterling spoke. We've got nursery places for the children. Your little girl could start on Monday, and when the baby is out of hospital, there will be a place for him too. Ada had exploded another myth. Second-class citizens could keep their children with them, but just look at the price they had to pay. Vicky was still in danger, her marriage hung in the balance, and now all this rowing. She did not know whether to feel ashamed or grateful. She felt both, in a way, especially as it now seemed that her threats had been empty ones. There was no need for them. She would not apologize to Trudy. That woman was a rotten liar anyway. They removed her name from the council list of approved child minders and, still scared of Ada's threats, maybe, she left Malden Road and moved to somewhere in Camden Town so that even if Vicky had died, Ada could not have carried out her threats. She left the group and walked home, crying quietly to herself. It was a cry of relief.